He rode away from one fight, only to find a whole town that needed saving. Buffalo Run. Chapter 1. You look like you've been rode hard and put away wet, friend. Rip Campbell opened one eye. The man speaking was old, with a beard like a tangle of dirty snow, and eyes that had been squinting at horizons for so long they were permanently crinkled at the corners. He sat by a small smoky fire, nursing a tin cup. Something like that, Rip said, his voice a dry rasp. The inside of his head felt like a blacksmith was using it for an anvil. He'd left Prospect Ridge 3 days ago with a bottle of whiskey and a powerful need to forget. The whiskey was gone. The forgetting hadn't quite taken. "That's Jeb Hawkins," another voice said, young and full of an earnestness that made Rip's headache worse. "He ain't got no manners." The speaker was a boy, really, maybe 19, with a face that hadn't yet learned how to hold a razor or a secret. His name was Sam Tate. "I'm Sam. The quiet one over there is Amos Cole." Rip's gaze shifted to the third man. Amos was carving a piece of wood with a knife, his movements economical and precise. He had the hard, flat eyes of a man who had seen too much, and the rigid posture of an ex-soldier. Amos met Rip's gaze, gave a single, almost imperceptible nod, and went back to his carving. He didn't need to say much. "We saw you ride in," Jeb said, taking a noisy sip from his cup. "Your horse looks trail-ready, but you look like you're about 5 minutes from falling out of that saddle for good. You headed for the Deadwood Hills?" "Looking for work," Rip said, which was a half-truth. He was looking for a direction that didn't lead back to a town full of ghosts. "Work?" Sam's face lit up. "Mister, there ain't work in the hills. There's gold. Piles of it, they say. Nuggets the size of a hen's egg, just sitting in the creek beds. We're headed for a boomtown called Buffalo Run. Gonna make our fortune." Jeb snorted. "The boy's got the fever. Thinks you just bend over and pick it up. I've been chasing color for 40 years. It ain't that easy. But the rumors this time, they got teeth." He leaned forward, his voice dropping. "They say a man can pan $100 worth before breakfast. That's why we're traveling together. The road to Buffalo Run is thick with men who'd rather use a gun than a shovel." Rip looked them over. The old-timer with his stories, the kid with his dreams, and the quiet soldier who looked like he could handle himself but was probably tired of doing it. A ragtag outfit with a bad case of gold fever, heading into dangerous country. It was Amos who finally spoke, his voice a low gravel. "You wear that Colt like you know how to use it." It wasn't a question. "We could use another gun. $10 a week and a share of the grub, just to see us to town safe. We're prospectors, not gunfighters." Rip thought about the $2 and change in his pocket. He thought about the headache, the empty bottle he'd left on the trail, and the long, empty miles ahead. $10 was $10. And riding with company, even this company, seemed marginally better than riding with his own thoughts. "All right," he said, swinging a leg over his saddle and dismounting. Sandy, his mare, let out a grateful sigh. "But I eat more than my share." Jeb grinned, showing a landscape of missing teeth. "A man who can shoot is welcome to it." The night came on fast, the fire a small island of light in a vast dark ocean. The talk was all of gold. Sam spoke of the house he would build for his mother. Jeb spun tales of lost mines and strikes he'd just missed. Amos said nothing, cleaning his rifle with a practiced efficiency. Rip listened, the whiskey headache slowly receding, replaced by the low, familiar hum of watchfulness. He took the last watch. The others were asleep, wrapped in their bedrolls. The fire was down to embers. The silence of the prairie was absolute. Rip sat with his back to a rock, his Winchester across his lap, his eyes scanning the darkness. He felt the attack, before he saw it. A shift in the night sounds. The nervous stamp of a horse. A shadow that was darker than the others moving at the edge of the camp. He didn't yell a warning. There wasn't time. He brought the Winchester to his shoulder, the stock fitting into the familiar hollow. A man rose from behind a clump of sagebrush, a rifle lifting. Rip fired. The crack of the shot was immense in the silence. The man grunted and fell. The camp exploded into chaos. Two more figures burst from the darkness, guns blazing. Bullets whined over Rip's head, sparking off the rock behind him. He levered another round, firing at a muzzle flash. A cry of pain answered him from the dark. Jeb and Sam were scrambling for their guns, shouting in confusion. Amos, however, moved with a soldier's instinct. He rolled out of his bedroll, his own rifle already in his hands, and laid down a covering fire toward the remaining attacker. The claim jumper, realizing he was now in a real fight and not just robbing sleeping men, broke and ran. Rip was already on his feet, moving in a low crouch. He circled around the edge of the camp, his Colt now in his hand, the Winchester left behind. He saw the man, a running silhouette against the starlit sky. Rip didn't shout. He didn't fire a warning shot. He aimed, squeezed the trigger, and the man tumbled to the dirt, his run finished for good. Silence fell again, thick with the smell of gunpowder. "Everybody, all right?" Rip called out, his voice calm. "We're all right," Jeb answered, his voice shaky. "Good God, son. You move like a catamount." Rip walked over to the first man he had shot, the one closest to the camp. He knelt beside the body, checking for anything that might identify him. The man was a drifter like 1,000 others, with nothing in his pockets but a worn-out knife and a plug of tobacco. But as Rip rolled him over, something fell from his shirt and glinted in the moonlight. It was a poker chip, made of brass, not clay. On one side was the image of a buffalo's head with a golden horn. Jeb Hawkins limped over, peering down at it. "Well, I'll be damned," he whispered, his voice full of a new kind of trouble. "He won that from a houseman, I'd wager." "You know it?" Rip asked, picking up the chip. It was heavy, well made. "I know of it," Jeb said, his easygoing manner gone, replaced by a grim seriousness. "That's the mark of the Golden Horn Saloon. Cyrus Vane's place. In Buffalo Run." He looked from the dead man to Rip, his eyes full of a dawning, ugly realization. "Looks like the trouble we were worried about on the trail was waiting for us at the end of it." Rip pocketed the chip, the cold metal a heavy weight against his palm. He looked out into the darkness, toward the Deadwood Hills, toward the town of Buffalo Run. He had signed on for $10 a week to guard against bandits. He had a feeling the job was about to get a whole lot more complicated. He walked over to the dead claim jumper's horse, a scrawny-looking beast. He untied the canteen from the saddle horn, took a long drink of the stale, warm water, and then began to systematically strip the saddle and bridle from the animal. Chapter 2. That's it. That's Buffalo Run. Sam Tate's voice was a mix of awe and something else, maybe disappointment. The town, if you could call it that, was less a town and more a wound in the landscape, a chaotic sprawl of mud-caked tents, half-finished pine shacks, and a few imposing two-story buildings that looked wildly out of place. The single main street was a river of ankle-deep muck, churned by the hooves of mules and the boots of 1,000 prospectors, all of them moving with a frantic, feverish energy. The whole place hummed with the sound of hammers, distant shouts, and the relentless, desperate hope of men chasing gold won. "She ain't pretty," Jeb Hawkins said, spitting a stream of tobacco juice into the mud. "But she's where the money is." He pointed with the stem of his pipe toward the largest building, a grand, false-fronted saloon with bat-wing doors and glass windows, a palace in the middle of the filth. That there is the Golden Horn. And the man who owns it owns the town. Cyrus Vane, Amos Cole said, his voice flat. He'd heard the name on the trail. It was a name spoken in whispers, part fear and part reverence. The very same, Jeb said. Owns the saloon. Owns that mercantile next to it with the high prices. Owns the little shack over there he calls a land office, where he'll sell you the right to dig in a creek he don't own. 2. As they rode further down the street, a commotion outside the mercantile drew their attention. 2 men had a third backed up against the muddy wall. One was a mountain, a hulking man with a face like a slab of raw meat, and a scar that twisted his lip into a permanent sneer. The other was lean and wiry, dressed in black, his hand resting on the pearl handle of a holstered pistol. He just watched, a bored expression on his face, letting the big man do the work. That's Vane's muscle, Jeb murmured, pulling his horse to a stop. The big one's Bull Ramsey. The snake in black is Silas Kane. 3. You got a problem, friend? Ramsey snarled at the prospector, his voice a low rumble. He shoved the man, who was small and weathered, back against the wall. I ain't got a problem, Bull, the prospector pleaded, his voice shaking. I just need another day. I hit a good patch, I swear. I just need one more day to pay the equipment fee. Mr. Vane ain't a patient man, Ramsey said, grabbing the prospector's small leather poke and opening it. He poured a few gleaming gold flakes into his palm. Looks like you got enough for a down payment. He pocketed the gold and shoved the man hard. Now get out of here before I get angry. The prospector scrambled away, his face a mask of shame and fury. Rip watched the whole exchange, his face impassive, but a stillness had come over him. His right hand, which had been resting on his thigh, dropped casually to his side, closer to the worn leather of his holster. His knuckles brushed the cold, checkered grip of his Colt. Amos saw the small movement, and his eyes narrowed, reading the intent. Easy, son, Jeb whispered, his voice a low warning. That ain't our fight. You tangle with Vane's boys, you're tangling with the whole town. Best to steer clear. 4. Rip didn't respond. He just watched Bull Ramsey and Silas Kane swagger back toward the Golden Horn, 2 wolves moving through a flock of sheep. He nudged Sandy forward. Let's get a drink, he said. The Golden Horn Saloon was an island of splendor in the sea of mud. A long mahogany bar gleamed under the light of oil lamps, even though it was the middle of the day. A piano played in the corner, and the air smelled of whiskey, cigar smoke, and money. Rip's eyes swept the room, taking in the hard-faced miners, the hopeful new arrivals, and the handful of Vane's men, all of them wearing the same brass buffalo chip pinned to their vests. At a back table, holding court, was a man in a tailored suit of charcoal gray. He was slender, with pale manicured hands and silver hair. He didn't look like a saloon owner. He looked like a banker or a senator. He exuded an air of quiet, absolute control. That had to be Cyrus Vane. Rip, Jeb, and Sam took a table, while Amos stood at the bar, preferring to keep his back to a wall. Rip ordered a whiskey and listened. The saloon was the town's nerve center, and if you listened long enough, you could learn its secrets. He didn't have to wait long. Bull Ramsey lumbered over to Vane's table, leaning down to speak in a low voice. That new bunch just rode in, Ramsey rumbled. The old man, the kid, and a couple of hard cases. Look like they're here for the long haul. Vane took a delicate sip of wine, a bored expression on his face. They all look like that when they arrive, he said, his voice soft but carrying in a lull in the noise. Hopeful. It's a shame we have to cure them of it. He smiled, a thin, predatory expression. Tell Henderson at the store, the price of shovels and pans just went up by 20%. And effective tomorrow, the assay office will require a new security fee to protect our clients' hard-won assets. 5. Ramsey grinned. They'll squawk. Let them squawk, Vane said, waving a dismissive hand. They have gold fever. A man with a fever will pay any price for a cure. Or in their case, for the tools to dig their own graves. 6. Jeb, who had also overheard, looked at Rip, his face grim. The town's a trap, he whispered. Rip didn't answer. He finished his whiskey in one smooth motion, the fiery liquid doing nothing to burn away the cold knot that had formed in his gut. He stood up and walked to the bar where Amos was standing. Another, he said to the bartender. The bartender, a man with nervous eyes, slid a glass toward him. Rip reached into his pocket and pulled out the brass poker chip he'd taken from the dead claim jumper on the trail. He placed it on the polished mahogany. It made a soft, definitive click. The bartender froze, his hand halfway to the whiskey bottle. His eyes darted from the chip to Rip's face, then flickered nervously toward the back of the room where Cyrus Vane was watching. The low hum of the saloon seemed to dip, the piano player fumbling a note. Rip just looked at the bartender, his face unreadable, and waited for his drink. Chapter 3. You trying to get us killed before we even get a shovel wet. Jeb Hawkins was looking at the brass poker chip Rip had brought back from the saloon the night before. It sat on the rough-hewn table in their rented shack, gleaming in the morning light. The shack itself wasn't much. 4 walls, a leaky roof, and the lingering smell of unwashed prospectors, but it was theirs for now. I was thirsty, Rip said, sipping a cup of coffee that was mostly chicory and grit. That was a message, son, Jeb said, shaking his head. You put that chip on Vane's bar. You were telling him you knew about the men he sent after us. You were telling him you weren't scared. People who ain't scared of Cyrus Vane tend to end up dead. We need a claim, Sam Tate said, his voice full of a nervous energy that ignored the old man's warning. He was practically vibrating with the need to get his hands in the dirt. We can talk about Vane later. First, we need to find some gold. To get a claim, you gotta go through Vane, Amos Cole said, his voice a flat statement of fact. He was checking the action on his rifle, a habit he probably picked up in the army and never lost. No way around it. Rip stood up, placing the empty cup on the table. Then let's go see the man. Vane's assay and claims office was a small hot box of a shack next to the mercantile. A weaselly-looking clerk with a green eyeshade and ink-stained fingers sat behind a high counter, looking down on them like a king on a rickety throne. He didn't bother to look up when they came in. We're here to file claims, Jeb said, trying for a friendly tone that didn't quite land. The clerk finished writing a line in his ledger, then slowly looked up, his expression one of profound boredom. Name of the creek. Buffalo Creek. North Fork, Jeb said. That's prime territory, the clerk said, a hint of a smirk on his lips. Mr. Vane has designated it a high-yield prospect zone. The filing fee is $20 per man. Sam gasped. $20? That's robbery. That's the price, the clerk said, his smirk widening. Don't like it. You can go pan in the mud puddles on the main street. Amos Cole, who had been silent, took a step forward, his hand clenching into a fist at his side. He leaned over the counter until his face was inches from the clerk's. You think it's funny, boy? Amos growled, his voice a low threat. Taking the last dollar from a man before he's even had a chance to earn one back. The clerk's smirk vanished, replaced by a flash of fear. He swallowed hard, his eyes darting to the door where Silas Kane leaned, watching the exchange with a lazy amusement. Before Amos could go any further, Rip placed a hand on his arm. Easy, Amos, he said, his voice quiet but firm. Amos shot him a furious look, but Rip just stared back, his gaze cold and steady. Amos, after a tense moment, took a reluctant step back. Rip turned his attention to the clerk. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't threaten. He just looked at him. "We'll take 4 claims," he said. He counted out the money, $80 of their pooled resources, and placed it on the counter. "And you'll give us a proper receipt?" The clerk, unnerved by Rip's flat, unwavering stare, scribbled out the receipts with a shaky hand. As they left, Rip saw Silas Kane push himself off the doorframe, a thoughtful, calculating look in his eyes. He'd seen Rip diffuse the situation, not with fists but with presence. And that, to a man like Kane, was far more interesting. An hour later, they were standing knee-deep in the cold, clear water of Buffalo Creek. The gold fever had taken hold of Sam again. He worked his pan with a frantic energy, sifting, shaking, his eyes wide with hope. Jeb and Amos worked with a slower, more methodical rhythm. Rip didn't pan. He sat on a rock downstream, his rifle across his lap, watching the trail. "Got something?" Sam yelled, his voice cracking with excitement. He held up his pan. In the bottom, nestled in a bed of black sand, were a half-dozen tiny gleaming flakes of gold. They weren't nuggets the size of hen's eggs, but they were real. The sight of it sent a jolt of energy through the group. They worked for the rest of the day, and by dusk they had a small but satisfying pile of flakes and dust collected in a leather poke. Enough to buy more supplies, enough to prove the rumors were true. They went back to the Golden Horn. Vane's buyer, a man with the dead eyes of a fish, had a set of scales on a table near the back. He weighed their poke, his face showing no emotion. "Not bad for a day's work," he said, his voice flat. "Call it $50. "50? Jeb protested. "That's got to be worth near double that." The buyer shrugged. $50 in store credit at the mercantile. Mr. Vane's policy. No cash payouts. The trap was complete. Vane took their money for the claim, then took their gold for credit at his own overpriced store. There was no way to win. There was only a way to lose, slowly. Defeated, they left the saloon and headed back toward their shack. As they passed a dark alley between the mercantile and the gunsmith's shop, they heard a low groan. Rip stopped. He drew his Colt and stepped into the darkness. Lying in a heap of trash was the small, weathered prospector Bull Ramsey had bullied earlier that day. His face was a swollen, bloody mess, one eye completely shut. "What happened to you?" Rip asked, kneeling beside him. The man coughed, spitting out a tooth. "Tried to sell to an independent," he wheezed. "A fella down in the tent city offered me cash. Vane's men. Ramsey and Kane, they were waiting for me on the way back." He groaned, clutching his ribs. "They took the money. And the gold. Said it was a lesson." Rip stood up, the cold fury that had been simmering inside him all day, finally hardening into a decision. He had seen the whole system now, from the false laws of the claims office to the brutal enforcement in the alleys. This wasn't a town. It was a plantation, and Cyrus Vane was the master. He looked at Jeb and Amos, their faces grim in the faint light from the street. "I'm tired of drinking his whiskey," Rip said, his voice quiet but with a new hard edge to it. "I'm going back to that saloon. I'm going to play some cards. A man can learn a lot in a poker game if he's paying attention to the players instead of the cards." Chapter 4. You in or out, friend? The cards ain't getting any younger. The man speaking was a beefy, red-faced enforcer for Cyrus Vane, a brass buffalo chip pinned crookedly to his dirty vest. He had a pair of jacks showing, and was acting like he held the world on a string. Rip Campbell looked at his own cards. A worthless hand. He'd been playing for an hour at a corner table in the Golden Horn Saloon, nursing a single whiskey. He wasn't there to win. He was there to listen. The saloon was Vane's throne room, and men with loose lips and heavy pockets often revealed more than they intended between hands of 5-card stud. "I'm out," Rip said, tossing his cards into the center of the table. He'd already learned a few things. He'd learned that Vane had men posted on the trails leading into town, men whose job it was to discourage independent buyers and sellers. He'd learned that the price of everything from flour to blasting powder was set daily by Vane himself. And he'd learned that the red-faced man across from him, whose name was Hackett, was a sore loser and a loudmouth. Sam Tate stood a few feet away, watching the game with the wide-eyed fascination of a kid at his first county fair. Jeb and Amos were at the bar, keeping their distance but watching Rip's back. The next hand was dealt. Rip stayed in. Hackett bet heavy, his confidence growing with every shot of cheap whiskey he threw back. The final cards were turned. Rip laid down 3 queens. Hackett stared at them, then at his own 2 pairs, his face turning a shade darker. "Hold on a minute," Hackett slurred, pointing a thick, unsteady finger not at Rip, but at Sam. "I seen it. That kid. He's been watching your shoulder. He signaled you." Sam's face went white. "What? No, I didn't. I was just watching." "Liar," Hackett roared, shoving his chair back and lurching to his feet. The whole saloon quieted down, the piano player fumbling a note. This was the kind of entertainment the Golden Horn was famous for. You've been in on it the whole time, helping your friend here cheat honest men out of their money. The only thing being cheated at this table is the whiskey bottle, Rip said, his voice low and calm. He didn't move from his chair. Hackett ignored him. He lunged at Sam, grabbing the front of the boy's shirt. "I'll teach you to cheat, you little whelp." Sam cried out, stumbling, his eyes wide with fear. Rip moved. It wasn't a flurry of motion. It was one clean, economical act. He rose from his chair, took 1 step, and threw a single perfectly timed right hand that landed squarely on Hackett's jaw. The sound was like a dry branch snapping. Hackett's eyes rolled back in his head. His grip on Sam's shirt went slack, and he crumpled to the floor in a heap, out cold before he even landed. The saloon was dead silent for a heartbeat. Then a voice like grinding rocks cut through the quiet. "You shouldn't have done that." Bull Ramsey was moving toward them, parting the crowd of onlookers like a ship through water. His face was set in a mask of grim pleasure. He'd been waiting for this. Rip pushed Sam behind him. The man was drunk and looking for a fight. "He found one," Ramsey said with a grin that showed his twisted lip. "And now, so have you." Ramsey threw a punch like a side of beef, a wild, powerful swing that would have taken a normal man's head off. Rip ducked under it, the wind of its passage stirring his hair. As he came up, he grabbed a whiskey bottle from a nearby table and smashed it over the head of another of Vane's men who was rushing in. Then the world exploded into chaos. The room erupted into a full-blown brawl. Men were shouting, chairs were splintering, glasses were shattering. It wasn't a fight anymore. It was a riot. Jeb Hawkins, letting out a wild cackle, swung a chair leg like a club, taking down a charging miner. Amos Cole moved with a brutal efficiency, using short, sharp jabs to the throat and kidneys, his face a cold, dispassionate mask as he cleared a path to the door. Rip grabbed Sam, who was frozen in shock, and shoved him toward Amos. "Get him out of here." Bull Ramsey came at him again, roaring with frustration. Rip sidestepped, kicking a chair into the big man's legs, sending him sprawling. From his table in the back, Cyrus Vane watched the entire affair without moving a muscle, his expression unreadable, though his eyes followed Rip with a new, cold intensity. He saw a man who was not just a fighter, but a leader. A man who created loyalty. And that was a threat he couldn't tolerate. Rip saw his chance. He vaulted over a table, kicked open the batwing doors, and burst out into the muddy street, Jeb and Amos right behind him with Sam in tow. They ran, gasping for breath, the sounds of the brawl fading behind them. They stopped 100 yards down the street, leaning against a wall, their knuckles bloody, their clothes torn. "Well," Jeb said, breathing hard but with a grin on his face. "That was more excitement than I've had in years." Rip wasn't listening. He was staring at the space next to them. It was a dark, empty lot, the ground blackened and littered with charred timbers. The faint smell of old smoke still hung in the air. "What was here?" Rip asked. "A mercantile," Jeb said, his good humor fading. "Opened about 6 months ago. Fella named Peterson ran it. Tried to compete with Vane. Offered fair prices for supplies, cash for gold." He shook his head. "Lasted about a month, before the whole place went up in smoke one night. Faulty lamp, they said. Real shame." The implication was as clear as a gunshot in the night. Vane didn't just discourage competition. He burned it to the ground. As Jeb spoke, his voice trailing off into the grim silence, a new wagon, its canvas cover clean and its sides freshly painted, slogged through the mud of the main street. It was loaded high with barrels, crates, and all the makings of a new enterprise. It pulled to a stop right in front of the empty, fire-scarred lot. A woman, tough and determined, sat on the driver's seat, her eyes already taking the measure of the town, completely unaware that she had just parked her dream on top of another man's grave. Chapter 5. This is the spot. Unhitch the team. The woman's voice was clear and steady, cutting through the afternoon clamor of the street. She stood on the buckboard of her wagon, hands on her hips, looking not at the muddy chaos of Buffalo Run, but at the one empty, fire-blackened lot as if it were a plot of promised land. Jeb Hawkins, standing with Rip and the others near their shack, shook his head and spat into the mud. "Lord have mercy. She's either the bravest woman in the Dakota Territory or the biggest fool." The woman was a widow. You could tell by the plainness of her dress and the lack of a man beside her, but there was nothing fragile about her. She had a strong jaw, eyes that looked like they'd seen trouble before and weren't impressed by it, and a way of holding herself that said she didn't expect help and probably wouldn't accept it if offered. Rip watched her climb down from the wagon, her movements sure and competent. He'd seen that look before, in men and women who had been pushed to the edge and had decided to start pushing back. Jeb, propelled by a sense of grizzled chivalry, ambled over. "Ma'am, you might want to rethink this particular piece of ground. The last fella who tried to set up shop here had some bad luck with a lamp." The woman turned her clear gray eyes on him. "I don't believe in bad luck, mister. I believe in faulty lamps and the men who light them. My name is Sarah Miles, and I'm opening a general store." She said it like she was announcing the sunrise, a simple fact that the world would have to get used to. From across the street, on the porch of the Golden Horn, a few of Vane's men were watching. Bull Ramsey was there, and the snake in black, Silas Kane. Kane just watched, a flicker of amusement in his eyes. He wasn't worried. He'd seen this play before. "She's got grit, I'll give her that," Amos Cole said quietly, his arms crossed as he leaned against the shack. "Grit gets you killed out here." "Sometimes it's all you've got," Rip said. He pushed himself off the wall and walked toward her. Sarah Miles watched him approach, her expression wary. She saw a man with bruised knuckles, a coldness in his eyes, and a gun that looked like it had grown from his hip. She put a hand on the axe handle that was leaning against her wagon wheel. Rip stopped a few feet away. He didn't offer a greeting. He just looked at the heavy barrels of nails and sacks of flour stacked on her wagon. "You'll need help with that," he said. It wasn't an offer, it was a statement. "I've gotten this far on my own," she replied, her chin tilted up. "You're not on your own anymore," Rip said. Before she could protest, he reached up, got his hands on a 100-pound sack of flour, and swung it onto his shoulder with a grunt. He carried it to the spot where her front door would be, and set it down. Sam and Jeb, seeing his lead, exchanged a look and hurried over to help. Even Amos, after a moment's hesitation, joined in. For the next hour they worked, a small island of defiant labor in the greedy, watchful town. The sun beat down, and the sweat ran, but a small mountain of supplies began to grow on the burned-out lot. Sarah worked alongside them, her initial wariness replaced by a grudging respect. She didn't thank them with words. She passed around a dipper of cool water from her barrel, her eyes acknowledging the debt. That night, a chill wind blew through the muddy street. Rip sat on the steps of their shack, cleaning his Colt by the faint light of a lantern. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The town was too quiet. After the brawl, he'd expected Vane to make a move. This silence was unnatural. He smelled it before he saw it. Kerosene. A sharp, oily scent on the wind. He looked across the street. Sarah's wagon, still half full, was a dark shape against the night. Near it, another shadow detached itself from the deeper darkness of an alley. Then another. 3 of them. One carried a lit torch, its flame a tiny, hungry predator in the dark. Rip put his pistol back together with a soft, metallic click. He didn't stand up. He didn't call out. He just melted off the steps and into the shadows, moving with a fluid silence that was more animal than man. He came up behind the mercantile, across the street from Sarah's wagon. He saw them clearly now. 2 of Vane's men he didn't know, and the third was Silas Kane. Kane wasn't holding a torch. He just stood back, watching, his arms crossed, as one of the others doused the wagon's canvas cover with kerosene. The man with the torch stepped forward, ready to touch the flame to the soaked canvas. Rip raised his Colt, the long barrel steady in his hand. He didn't aim for the man. He aimed for the torch. He squeezed the trigger. The gunshot was a flat, brutal crack that shattered the night's quiet. The torch struck dead center, exploded in a shower of sparks and flaming pitch. The man holding it screamed, dropping the burning stick and frantically beating at the fire that had caught on his sleeve. The torch landed in the mud, hissing and sputtering, setting a small, harmless patch of greasy water alight. "Drop it," Rip's voice came out of the darkness, cold and calm. The second man, who had been reaching for his gun, froze. Silas Kane, however, hadn't moved a muscle. He slowly turned his head, his eyes peering into the shadows where Rip was hidden. He couldn't see him, but he knew he was there. "This ain't your business, Drifter," Kane called out, his voice smooth as silk. "You're making it my business," Rip's voice answered back. "You and Vane. You like to burn things. It's a coward's way of fighting." "Courage is expensive," Kane said with a soft chuckle. "Mr. Vane prefers efficiency." He took a slow step back, pushing his men before him. "There will be other nights." "Maybe not for you," Rip said. Kane paused. The threat hung in the air between them, sharp and clear. Kane was no fool. He knew he was in a bad spot, exposed and with a man of unknown skill holding a gun on him from the dark. He made a decision. "This town has rules," Kane said. "You'll learn them soon enough." He and his men backed away into the alley and vanished, leaving behind the smell of kerosene and the small, sputtering fire in the mud. Lights came on in the shacks. People peered out. Sarah Miles burst from the tent she had pitched behind her wagon, a shotgun in her hands, her face a mask of fury. She saw the smoking torch, the dark, wet stain on her wagon's canvas, and she understood. Rip walked out of the shadows, his Colt still in his hand. He looked at the wagon, at the ruined sacks of flour and sugar that had been soaked with kerosene. The goods weren't burned, but they were spoiled. Ruined. Sarah looked at the damage, then at Rip, her defiant anger giving way to a flicker of despair. "He won't let me build," she said, her voice tight. Rip holstered his pistol. He walked over to the wagon, ignoring the stench of the kerosene. He reached in and pulled out a heavy crate of tinned goods, the metal untouched by the poison. He set it on the ground, the thud a solid, definitive sound in the night. "Then we'll just have to build faster," he said, turning back to haul out another. Chapter 6. Find anything besides bad memories. Sarah Miles stood with her arms crossed, watching Rip poke through the charred debris of the old mercantile lot with the tip of his knife. The morning sun did little to warm the cold, black timbers. They had salvaged what they could from her wagon, but the smell of kerosene still clung to the air like a bitter promise. "Just ashes," Rip said, not looking up. He sifted through a pile of blackened dirt. He wasn't looking for anything big. Big things get noticed. He was looking for what a man might drop by accident in the dark when he's in a hurry to light a fire. He was looking for a mistake. He found it near the back of the lot, half buried in the soot. A small brass token, stamped with the image of a buffalo's head, just like the one he'd taken off the dead claim jumper on the trail. Vane's men were getting careless. Or arrogant. Rip pocketed the chip without a word. "They'll be back," Sarah said. It wasn't a question. "They'll be back," Rip confirmed. He stood up, wiping the soot from his hands. "But not here. Not for a while. They made their point. Now they'll wait for you to starve, or quit." He looked over at her half-built store, a skeleton of new pine against the blackened ground. "You're not the quitting kind." "No," she said, her jaw set. "I'm not." "Then I've got some business to attend to," Rip said. He left her there and went to find Jeb. The old prospector was trying to mend a harness, his hands clumsy but determined. "I need to know where the smaller camps are," Rip said. "The ones off the main creek. Places a man might go to lie low." Jeb looked up, his eyes narrowed. "You going looking for a hornet's nest to kick?" "Just want to see how the other half lives," Rip said. Jeb sighed, spitting a stream of tobacco juice. "There's a cluster of claims up in a place called Whiskey Gulch. It's rough country. A man could get lost up there if he wasn't careful." He gave Rip a long look. "Or if someone wanted him to get lost." Rip nodded. "Whiskey Gulch," he said, and walked away. He rode Sandy out of town, keeping to the low ground, avoiding the main trails. It took him 2 hours to find the place, a narrow, ugly gulch with a trickle of a stream running through it. A half-dozen tents were pitched along the banks, and a few lonely-looking men were working claims, their movements slow and without the feverish hope of the main creek. These were the men on the margins, the ones Vane hadn't bothered to squeeze yet. Rip tethered Sandy in a thicket of pine and climbed a rocky rise that overlooked the small camp. He settled in, his rifle resting in the crook of his arms, and waited. He didn't have to wait long. He heard them before he saw them, the sound of shod horses on rock. Bull Ramsey rode into the camp, as if he owned it, 2 of his cronies behind him. They didn't dismount. They sat on their horses, looming over the nervous prospectors. "Afternoon, gentlemen," Ramsey boomed, his voice full of false cheer. His nose, Rip noted with a certain satisfaction, was swollen and bruised, a mottled purple from their barroom dance. "Just making the rounds. Ensuring the safety and security of the good people of this district." A prospector with a long gray beard looked up from his pan. "We ain't got no trouble here, Bull." "That's because we're here to stop it before it starts," Ramsey said with a grin. "Mr. Vane is very concerned about the recent lawlessness in the area. Claim jumpers. Thieves." He paused, letting his gaze drift over to Rip's hiding place as if he knew he was being watched. "Hired guns stirring up trouble. For your own protection, he's instituted a weekly safety tax. $5 per man." The prospectors looked at each other, their faces a mixture of fear and resentment. $5 was a fortune. It was food. It was supplies. For some of them, it was everything they had. "We ain't got $5, the old prospector said, his voice quiet. Ramsey's grin vanished. He swung down from his horse, his immense bulk seeming to block out the sun. He strode over to the man and kicked his pan, sending water, gravel, and a few precious flakes of gold flying. "Then I suggest you find it," Ramsey snarled. "Unless you want to find your tent burned down around your ears." That was enough. Rip had seen what he needed to see. He wasn't going to let this play out. He raised his Winchester. He didn't aim at Ramsey. He aimed at the coffee pot sitting on the small fire in the center of the camp. He fired. The coffee pot exploded, sending a scalding geyser of coffee and grounds into the air. Ramsey's two men, who had been laughing, yelped in surprise, one of them getting splashed. They scrambled for their guns. Rip fired again. A bullet kicked up the dirt right in front of Ramsey's boots. A third shot tore a tin plate from a prospector's table, sending it spinning into the creek. "Get out of here!" Rip's voice echoed down from the rocks, cold and hard. Ramsey's men panicked. They weren't fighters, they were bullies. Being shot at by a ghost they couldn't see was not what they'd signed on for. They wheeled their horses around and galloped away, leaving Ramsey standing alone. Bull Ramsey stared up at the rocks, his face a mask of pure impotent rage. "Campbell, I know it's you. Show your face, you coward." Rip obliged. He stood up, a silhouette against the sky. He didn't raise his rifle. He just stood there, watching. Ramsey, seeing him, let out a roar and charged up the rocky slope on foot. It was a foolish, angry move. Rip waited until he was halfway up, then slid down the other side of the rise, circling around. Ramsey reached the top, finding it empty. When he turned, breathing hard, Rip was standing 10 feet behind him. Before Ramsey could even register the surprise, Rip closed the distance. He didn't throw a punch. He drove the steel buttplate of his Winchester straight into Ramsey's face. The sound was a sickening crunch. Ramsey staggered backward, blood pouring from his shattered nose, his eyes wide with shock and pain. He tripped over a rock and fell hard. Rip stood over him. "This is my only warning," he said, his voice dangerously quiet. "Stay away from these men. Stay away from the woman. The next time we have this conversation, I won't use the butt of my rifle." He turned and walked away, leaving Ramsey bleeding and humiliated in the dust. Back in town, night had fallen. Cyrus Vane stood behind the bar of the Golden Horn, polishing a glass. The doors flew open, and Bull Ramsey stumbled in, holding a bloody rag to his face, his cronies helping him stand. Vane looked at his chief enforcer, at the fresh ruin of his face. He didn't get angry. His expression didn't even change. He just placed the glass down with a soft click. He had underestimated the drifter. An insult could be tolerated. A barroom brawl could be forgiven. But this public humiliation, this direct challenge to his authority, could not stand. He was no longer dealing with a nuisance. He was dealing with a rebellion. He walked over to his desk in the corner. He took out a clean sheet of paper, a pen, and a bottle of ink. He began to write, his script neat and precise. When he was done, he handed the paper to his bartender. "Nail this to the front door, and on the post office, and on the door of the mercantile." The bartender read the words, his face going pale. "Wanted. For robbery, assault, and incitement of violence. The man known as Rip Campbell. $500. Dead or alive." Chapter 7. $500. Dead or alive. The prospector who read the words from the freshly nailed bounty poster did so in a hushed, horrified whisper. A small crowd of them stood in the muddy street, staring at Rip Campbell's name written in Cyrus Vane's elegant, unforgiving script. The sun was barely up, but the threat cast a long, cold shadow over the entire town. "He's branded him," another man muttered. "Now, any two-bit gunman with an empty pocket and a taste for blood will be coming for him." "It ain't just him Vane's branded," Jeb Hawkins said, his voice a low growl. He'd walked up behind them, his face grim. "That's a message for all of us. It says, this is what happens when you don't play by my rules. First, he beats a man for selling his own gold. Then he tries to burn out a woman for the crime of wanting to open a store. Now he's putting a price on the head of the only man who's had the guts to stand up to him." Jeb looked around at the faces of the other prospectors, men who had come to these hills with dreams of freedom and fortune, only to find themselves in another kind of company town, choking on Cyrus Vane's dust. "I don't know about you boys," Jeb said, his voice rising, "but I'm getting tired of the taste." That night, the rebellion began. It wasn't a thing of guns and shouting. It started as a whisper, a secret meeting in the half-built skeleton of Sarah Miles' general store. By the light of a few shielded lanterns, a dozen or so of the bravest or most desperate prospectors gathered. They sat on nail kegs and stacks of lumber, their faces a mixture of fear and a new, unfamiliar anger. Sam Tate, his youthful face set with a grim maturity he hadn't possessed a week ago, spoke first. "We can't let him do it. We can't let him hunt Rip like an animal just because Rip stood up for us." "The boy's right," Amos Cole said, his voice cutting through the murmurs of agreement. He stood with his back to a support beam, his arms crossed. "But this isn't about just one man anymore. This is about Vane's stranglehold. He owns the supplies, he owns the claims, he owns the price of gold. As long as that's true, we're just slaves digging in his private mine." A miner with a shifty, nervous gaze named Cal Weaver spoke up. "So what do we do, Amos? Go up against Bull Ramsey and Silas Kane with pickaxes? Vane's got a dozen men on his payroll. We don't fight him with guns." "Not yet," Amos said. "We fight him with gold. Our gold." He laid out the plan he, Jeb, and Sam had hatched. "We pool what we find. All of it. We choose one man, a man we trust, to ride it to Deadwood. He sells it there for cash, for real dollars. And he buys supplies, flour, bacon, blasting powder, whatever we need, at fair prices, and he brings it back. We cut Vane out. We bleed him dry." The idea was audacious. It was dangerous. It was their only hope. A buzz of excited, nervous conversation filled the small space. It was a declaration of economic independence. The back door creaked open, and Rip Campbell stepped inside. The room went silent. All eyes turned to him, the man with a $500 price on his head. He looked tired, bruised, but his eyes were as hard and steady as ever. He listened as Amos laid out the plan for him. He gave a slow nod when he was finished. "It's a good plan," Rip said, his voice quiet. "It might even work." He let his gaze sweep over the faces in the room, lingering on each one for a second. "If it stays in this room." A nervous silence fell. "Vane has ears everywhere," Rip continued. "In the saloon, on the street. He pays men for information. A man with a loose tongue or a weak spine could get you all killed. One word of this plan gets back to Vane, and that rider you send to Deadwood will end up in a ditch with his throat cut." He looked around the room again. "The plan needs one more thing. A safe route. The main trail to Deadwood is watched. I'll ride out tonight. Scout the back trails, the high passes. Find a way through the hills that Vane's men don't know about." Jeb nodded. "It's settled then. We take an oath. What's said here stays here. We live together, or we die separate." One by one, the men in the room nodded their agreement. They made a solemn pact, their faces illuminated by the flickering lantern light, a small band of rebels bound by a shared desire for freedom. Cal Weaver, the shifty-eyed miner, nodded along with them, his expression as earnest as any of the others. Rip watched him, a flicker of professional distrust in his gut. The man was too eager. An hour later, the meeting was over. The men slipped away, in twos and threes, melting back into the darkness of the town. Rip was checking the cinch on Sandy's saddle, preparing to ride out, when he saw a figure detach itself from the shadows near Sarah's store. It was Cal Weaver. The man looked left and right, his movements furtive and quick, like a rat leaving a sinking ship. He clutched his hat to his head and scurried down a side alley, keeping to the deepest pockets of darkness. He wasn't heading for his tent. He was heading for the back of the town, for the alley that ran behind the Golden Horn Saloon. Rip stayed where he was, a motionless shadow by his horse. He watched until Weaver disappeared. He had warned them there was a snake in their midst. He just hadn't realized it would show itself so soon. He knew, with a cold certainty, that his ride to scout a safe trail had just become a ride into a well-laid trap. He finished tightening the cinch, his movements slow and deliberate. Across town, Cal Weaver crept up to the back door of the Golden Horn Saloon, the one used for whiskey deliveries and back-alley deals. He looked over his shoulder one last time, then raised a trembling hand and knocked 3 soft, distinct times. Chapter 8. The trail Rip chose wasn't safe. He knew that before he'd even cleared the last of the town's smelly outbuildings. A safe trail was low ground, winding and hidden. The trail he took climbed, heading for the high, rocky spine that overlooked the entire valley. It was a place a man would go if he wanted to be seen, or if he wanted to draw a snake out of its hole. He rode with a loose rein, letting Sandy pick her way through the scree. He wasn't looking for a path to Deadwood. He was looking for a place to be killed. He scanned the rocks, his eyes narrowed, reading the terrain not as a traveler, but as a man expecting a bullet. He saw the spot a half-mile before he got there. A narrow pass between 2 granite outcrops, with a jumble of boulders on the ridge above. A perfect shooting gallery. A place where 4 or 5 men could pin down a regiment. He kept riding toward it. He had a brass poker chip in his pocket that said Cyrus Vane was a man who liked to stack the deck. He had the memory of Cal Weaver's back disappearing into an alley that said the cards were already dealt. Riding into the pass was the only way to see the hand he'd been played. He was 50 yards from the mouth of the pass when the first shot came. It wasn't a warning. It was a heavy slug from a Sharp's rifle that cracked the air an inch from his head and punched a hole in the rock behind him with the sound of a hammer hitting stone. Sandy screamed, a high, terrified sound, and reared violently. Rip, caught by surprise by the sheer force of the mare's panic, was thrown from the saddle. He hit the ground hard, the impact jarring every bone in his body, his rifle flying from his grasp. Sandy, wild-eyed and terrified, bolted, galloping back down the trail, a riderless horse fleeing a fight its master was just beginning. Rip rolled, ignoring the fire in his shoulder, and scrambled for the meager cover of a low boulder. A hail of lead followed him, bullets sparking off the rock, whining past his ears, chewing up the dirt around him. They weren't trying to scare him. They were trying to put him in the ground. He drew his Colt, the familiar weight a cold comfort in his hand. He peered over the edge of the boulder. Muzzle flashes from the ridge above. At least 4 of them. He was outgunned, on foot, and pinned down. A bad spot. He fired twice, not aiming for a man, but for the dark shadows between the rocks where they were hiding. The shots were meant to make them duck, to buy him a second. A man on the ridge laughed, a high, ugly sound. "Nowhere to run, Campbell. Your horse is gone. We got $500, says you die right here." Rip didn't answer. He was already moving, crawling backward, using every dip and fold in the ground to slide away from the boulder. They had him pinned, but they thought he was still behind that rock. He moved 20 feet to his left, to a shallow wash filled with loose gravel. He took off his hat, raised it slowly on the barrel of his Colt, and poked it over the edge of the wash. 2 rifles roared from the ridge, and his hat flew into the air, a fresh hole punched clean through the crown. But while they were shooting at his hat, he was watching their flashes. He had them now. One behind a dead pine, another in a notch between 2 gray stones. He rested his pistol on the edge of the wash, took a steadying breath, and aimed for the notch. He squeezed the trigger. The shot was clean. The man in the notch grunted, stood up as if to ask a question, and then toppled forward, his rifle clattering down the rocks. 1 down. The man behind the dead pine started firing wildly, spraying bullets all over the wash, trying to suppress a target he could no longer see. Rip ignored him. He was focused on a 3rd man, one who was trying to circle around to get a better angle. Rip waited. The man darted from one boulder to another. He was fast, but he wasn't fast enough. Rip fired just as the man left cover, the bullet catching him in the leg. The man screamed and went down, trying to crawl back to safety. 2 down. The remaining men on the ridge seemed to lose their nerve. Their fire became sporadic, panicked. They had come for an easy kill, a simple execution for $500. They hadn't counted on the target shooting back with such deadly efficiency. This was his chance. Rip holstered his Colt and scrambled further down the wash. It deepened, turning into a steep, narrow ravine choked with loose rock and thorny brush. It was his only way out. He didn't hesitate. He half ran, half slid down the ravine, the sharp rocks tearing at his clothes and his skin, the thorns ripping at his hands. He fell the last 10 feet, landing in a painful heap at the bottom. He lay there for a minute, gasping for breath, his body a symphony of new aches. He was battered, bleeding, and without a horse. But he was alive. He pushed himself to his feet and began the long, painful walk back to town. He stumbled into the prospectors' camp just as the sun was setting. He was a mess of dirt, blood, and torn cloth. Jeb, Sam, and Amos were gathered around a fire, their faces etched with worry. They looked up as he approached, their eyes going wide. Rip. My God, what happened? Sam cried, rushing forward. Your horse came back an hour ago, all lathered up. Rip walked past him and straight into the center of their small circle. He looked from one man to the next, his gaze hard and accusatory. He saw Cal Weaver in the back of the group, trying to look as surprised as everyone else, but failing. I went out to scout a safe trail, Rip said, his voice a low, dangerous growl that commanded their absolute attention. But somebody told Vane's men where I was going. Somebody told them which trail I'd take. He let the words hang in the air. The small group of prospectors, who had been united in their defiance just hours before, now looked at each other, a flicker of suspicion in their eyes. There's a leak in this camp, Rip said, his gaze sweeping over all of them, making every man feel the weight of his stare. There's a man standing here right now who took an oath and then sold us all out for Vane's coin. I don't know which one of you it is, but I will. He paused, letting the threat settle. And until I do, I don't trust a single one of you. Chapter 9. A bad feeling had settled over the prospectors' camp, thick and foul as creek-bottom mud. Rip's accusation had poisoned the air. Men who had shared coffee and bacon that morning now looked at each other with suspicion, wondering who among them had sold him out for Cyrus Vane's coin. They worked their claims in silence, the easy camaraderie gone, replaced by the solitary guarded labor of men who no longer trusted their neighbors. Rip did nothing to ease the tension. He let it fester. A nervous man makes mistakes. He spent the day cleaning his weapons, tending to the scrapes he'd earned in the ravine, and watching. He sat on a rock near the edge of their camp, seemingly absorbed in his work, but his eyes missed nothing. He watched how Cal Weaver, the miner with the shifty gaze, avoided looking anyone in the eye. He watched how Cal's hands trembled when he tried to light his pipe. That evening, Rip walked over to the fire where Jeb and Amos were sitting. "Found a new way out," he said, his voice low enough that it wouldn't carry far, but loud enough that anyone nearby who was trying to listen might catch it. "The North Spur Trail. It's a goat path, but it bypasses the main road completely. Comes out about 5 miles west of Deadwood." Jeb looked up, his eyes sharp. "You sure it's clear?" "Clear enough," Rip said. "We'll move the gold tonight. After moonrise. One rider, moving fast. We'll use the kid. Sam. No one will suspect a boy on a pony." Amos nodded slowly, playing his part. "A lot of risk to put on the boy." "It's more risk to wait," Rip said, and then he walked away, leaving the bait in the water. He saw Cal Weaver, who had been pretending to mend a shovel handle nearby, suddenly go very still. Cal didn't look up. He just kept his head down, his hands fumbling with his work. But Rip knew he'd heard. An hour later, as the men were finishing their meager supper of beans and hardtack, Cal stood up. Gotta check a snare I set up the ridge," he mumbled to no one in particular, and then he slipped away from the firelight. Rip gave him a 5-minute head start. Then he rose, stretching as if to work the kinks out of his bruised muscles. "Gonna take a walk," he said to Jeb. "Clear my head." He didn't follow Cal directly. He circled wide, moving through the trees like a ghost, keeping the man's furtive, hurrying shape in sight. Cal wasn't heading up the ridge. He was heading for town. He scurried through the darkness, sticking to the alleys, a rat in a maze, until he reached the back of the Golden Horn Saloon. He knocked 3 times. The door opened a crack, and he slipped inside. Rip didn't need to see any more. He turned and walked back toward the creek, finding a spot in the deep shadows beneath a willow tree, and waited. It was almost an hour before Cal came back. He was walking with a new swagger, the fear gone from his step, replaced by the false courage of a man with a few of Vane's dollars and a belly full of Vane's whiskey. He whistled a tuneless, off-key melody as he walked along the creek bank, heading back toward the camp. He was so pleased with himself, he never saw the shadow detach itself from the willow tree. "Evening, Cal." Cal Weaver yelped, spinning around, his hand flying to the knife at his belt. He stopped when he saw Rip standing there, the moonlight glinting off the long silver barrel of the Colt in his hand. The pistol wasn't pointed at him. It was just held, casual and steady at Rip's side. It was more menacing than if it had been aimed at his heart. "Rip. You startled me," Cal stammered, his face going pale. "I was just checking my line." "Your line runs all the way to Cyrus Vane's back door, does it?" Rip said, his voice quiet. He took a step closer. "That's a long way to go for a rabbit." Cal started to sweat. "I don't know what you're talking about." "I think you do," Rip said. He took another step. "I think you went and told Vane all about our little plan. The North Spur Trail. Sam riding out at moonrise. You sang him the whole song, didn't you, Cal?" "No. I swear." Cal's voice was a high-pitched squeak. Rip raised the Colt. The hammer came back with a soft, oily click that was the loudest sound in the world. He aimed it directly at Cal's chest. "I'm tired," Rip said, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. "I've been shot at, thrown from my horse, and lied to. I'm not in the mood for games. So you're going to tell me the truth. Or I'm going to leave you here for the coyotes to find in the morning. And they'll find you in 2 pieces." The bluff, the bravado, All of it crumbled away from Cal Weaver, leaving only a pathetic, trembling core of fear. Tears welled in his eyes. "Don't kill me," he whimpered, his knees seeming to buckle. "Please don't kill me." "That depends on what you say next," Rip said. "He pays me." Cal sobbed, the words tumbling out of him. "Just a few dollars. And whiskey. All the whiskey I want." He just wanted to know what the other men were saying. Who was complaining? "I didn't mean for anyone to get hurt. I swear to God, Rip, I didn't know they were going to try and kill you." "But you told them," Rip stated. "You told them tonight about the North Spur." Cal nodded miserably, tears streaming down his face. He said he just wanted to send some men to block the trail. To scare the boy. That's all. I wouldn't have told him if I knew they were going to kill somebody. Rip looked at the sniveling, broken man before him. He could pull the trigger. It would be easy. It would be justice, of a kind. The camp would be safer. But all he saw was a weak man who had made a bad choice, a man drowning in fear and cheap whiskey. Killing him would be like stepping on a bug. It wouldn't solve the real problem. The real problem was the man who paid for the information. "Get up," Rip said, his voice laced with contempt. Cal stared at him, confused. "What?" "Get up," Rip repeated. "Get your things from your tent. And then you start walking. You walk out of this camp, and you don't ever come back. You go back to Vane. You go to Deadwood. I don't care. But if I ever see your face in this camp, or on this creek again." He let the sentence hang in the air, the threat more potent for being unspoken. Cal scrambled to his feet, his eyes wide with disbelief and a dawning, desperate relief. You're letting me go." "A man like you isn't worth the price of a bullet," Rip said, holstering his Colt. "Now get out of my sight." Cal Weaver didn't need to be told twice. He turned and ran, stumbling through the darkness, a man who had been given a second chance he didn't deserve. Rip watched him go, a sour taste in his mouth. He had flushed out the traitor. But now Vane knew that he knew. The game had changed again. He turned his back on the empty creek bank and started walking toward the fire, toward the men who had trusted a snake, his boots leaving deep, angry prints in the soft earth. Chapter 10. Put your back into it, old man. This wall won't raise itself. Amos Cole's gruff command was directed at Jeb Hawkins, who was grunting and straining to lift a heavy pine beam into place. The half-built frame of Sarah Miles' general store was a hive of activity, a defiant testament to community in a town built on greed. After Rip had banished the traitor, Cal Weaver, a new resolve had settled over the small band of prospectors. They had an enemy they could see, and a cause they could fight for. So they'd traded their pans for hammers. "I'm a prospector, not a damn carpenter," Jeb grumbled, sweat beading on his forehead. "My business is with the earth, not the sky." "Today, your business is with this beam," Amos said without sympathy. Rip worked alongside them, his movements quiet and efficient. He said little, but his presence was a steadying force. He was the reason they felt safe enough to build at all. Sarah was in the middle of it all, directing the work, her hands as calloused as any of the men's, her face smudged with dirt but set with a look of unbreakable determination. She was building her future, one nail at a time, right on the ashes of the last man who had tried to defy Cyrus Vane. They were so focused on their work, on the simple, honest labor of it, that they didn't see him coming until he was already there. Silas Kane. He hadn't come with a crew this time. He just appeared, a lean shadow in black, standing at the edge of the lot, his left arm held a little stiffly at his side. He wasn't looking at the men. He was looking at Sarah. He walked toward her, his boot heels making soft, menacing prints in the mud. The hammering stopped. The men tensed, their hands moving from their tools to rest closer to the pistols at their belts. "Ma'am," Kane said, his voice smooth as polished stone. He tipped his hat. "Mr. Vane has asked me to convey his concerns. He's a civic-minded man. He worries about the safety of new construction. Faulty lumber. The risk of fire." He let the word hang in the air, a silken threat. "He would consider it a personal tragedy if all your hard work were to come to nothing." Before Sarah could reply, Rip stepped forward, moving between her and Kane. He didn't draw his gun. He just stood there, blocking Kane's path. "She's not interested in Vane's concerns," Rip said, his voice flat. Kane's gaze shifted to Rip. The lazy amusement was gone from his eyes, replaced by a cold, professional assessment. "I wasn't speaking to you, Drifter. This is a business matter between Mr. Vane and the lady." "I'm making it my business," Rip said. "Now turn around and walk away." A slow, cold smile touched Kane's lips. He had been waiting for this. The brawl was for Bull Ramsey. This was different. This was a matter of reputation. "I don't take orders from hired guns with a bounty on their head." "Then you can take one from mine," Rip said. It happened faster than a thought. Kane's smile tightened, a subtle tensing of the muscles around his eyes. His right hand, which had been resting near his belt buckle, blurred into motion, dropping toward the pearl-handled Colt at his hip. But Rip was already moving. He wasn't faster in the hand, maybe. But he was faster in the head. He had seen the decision in Kane's eyes a fraction of a second before the man's body had obeyed it. Rip's own draw was a single, fluid motion, a practiced economy of violence. His Colt was clear of the holster, cocked, and fired before Kane's pistol had even leveled. The two gunshots sounded almost as one, a deafening, echoing roar that sent birds scattering from the rooftops. Kane cried out, a sharp, angry sound of pain and surprise. He stumbled back, his pistol clattering into the mud. A dark, ragged hole had appeared in his right forearm, and blood was already soaking his sleeve. Rip's bullet hadn't killed him. It had crippled him. It had taken his gun hand. Rip stood there, his own pistol still smoking, aimed steady at Kane's heart. The other prospectors had their guns out now, a half-dozen pistols all pointed at the wounded enforcer. Kane clutched his bleeding arm, his face a pale mask of fury and humiliation. He had been beaten. In the open. In front of the whole town, which was now peering from doorways and windows. He, the fastest gun in Buffalo Run, had been proven second best. He looked at Rip, his eyes full of a cold, murderous promise. "This ain't over." "It is for today," Rip said. Kane, without another word, turned and walked away, clutching his shattered arm, his back ramrod straight even in defeat. A ragged cheer went up from the prospectors. Sarah rushed to Rip's side, her face pale but her eyes shining. "Are you all right?" "He missed," Rip said, holstering his Colt. That afternoon, Sarah Miles officially opened her store. The front wall was still missing, but she laid a plank over 2 barrels as a counter and began to sell her goods. And the people came. First a few, then a dozen. Miners and their wives, tired of Vane's prices, bought flour and coffee from her at a fair price, paying with the gold dust Vane refused to accept as cash. Her small, defiant act of commerce was a bigger blow to Cyrus Vane than any gunfight. In the Golden Horn saloon, Vane listened to the report from one of his men, his face impassive. Silas Kane was being tended to by a sawbones, his gun hand shattered, his career as a feared enforcer likely over. The drifter, Campbell, had not only defied him, but had publicly bested his top man. And now, the woman's store was bleeding his profits dollar by dollar. His strategy of targeting individuals had failed. Rip Campbell was a catalyst, turning scattered, fearful men into an organized rebellion. Vane sat at his table, swirling the wine in his glass. He looked at the few men he had left, who weren't wounded or cowed. He had been trying to trim the branches. It was time to take an axe to the root. He looked at Bull Ramsey, who was nursing a whiskey, his face still a mess of bruises. "Ramsey," Vane said, his voice soft as silk but cold as a grave. "Gather every man we have left. And the new guns from Deadwood. I'm tired of playing with the shepherd." A thin, cruel smile touched his lips. "It's time to scatter the flock." Chapter 11. They just took it. Rode in like they owned the damn creek, and told me to pack my gear. The man who stumbled into Sarah's half-finished store was gasping for breath, his face pale with fury and disbelief. He was a prospector named Henderson, a quiet man who kept to himself. 4 of them, Vane's men, said my claim was in arrears on some new tax. Said it was forfeit. They're working it right now. Rip was sitting on a nail keg, checking the action on his Colt. He didn't look up, but every man in the room felt the temperature drop. He'd known Vane would retaliate after Kane's public humiliation. He just hadn't known it would be this blatant. Vane had given up on subtlety. This was open warfare. "It's happening up at Miller's camp too," another man said, hurrying in behind Henderson. They ran off 3 men. Just took their sluice boxes and started washing their gravel. Amos Cole, who was leaning against a support beam, pushed himself off the wall. "He's not trying to scare us anymore. He's trying to starve us out. No claims, no gold. No gold, no supplies. We last a week, maybe 2, before we have to crawl back to him or ride out with nothing." "So what do we do?" Sam Tate asked, his youthful face tight with worry. "We can't guard every claim on every creek." "No," Rip said, finally looking up. He slid his pistol back into its holster. "We can't. So we stop playing defense." He stood up, his eyes sweeping over the small group of men gathered in the store. There were maybe a dozen of them who had sworn the oath. A dozen farmers and miners against Vane's army of hired guns. "We're done waiting for them to hit us. We're going hunting." He looked at Amos. "You, me, Jeb, and Sam. We ride. The rest of you stay here. Guard the store. Guard the town. If one of Vane's men so much as spits in the street, you make him regret it." "It's a fool's errand, Rip," Jeb argued. 4 of us against who knows how many. They'll cut us to pieces in those hills." "They're not expecting a fight," Rip said, his voice flat. "They're expecting sheep. We're going to show them they've run into a pack of wolves." They rode out 10 minutes later, 4 riders against an empire of mud and greed. They didn't take the main trail. Rip led them through the back alleys and into the hills, following a winding deer path that kept them below the ridgelines. The air was still and hot, the only sound the clink of their horses' hooves on the rock. They found the first group of claim jumpers in a narrow canyon. 4 of Vane's men, laughing and joking as they worked a sluice box they'd stolen from Henderson. They had rifles, but they were leaning against a rock 20 feet away. They were comfortable. Arrogant. Rip and his small posse dismounted, leaving their horses tied in a grove of aspens. They crept forward on foot, using the rocks and brush for cover. "I'll take the 2 on the left," Rip whispered to Amos. "You take the 2 on the right. Jeb, Sam, you're our reserve. Don't fire unless you have to." They moved into position. Rip gave a soft whistle, the sound of a canyon wren. The 4 men looked up from the sluice box, their laughter dying in their throats. They saw 4 rifles pointed at them from the rocks above. "Morning, boys," Rip called out, his voice casual. "That looks like hard work. I suggest you take a rest." The men stared, their faces a mixture of shock and fear. One of them, a big bearded man, slowly started to raise his hands. But another, younger and more foolish, made a desperate dive for the leaning rifles. Amos's rifle cracked once. A puff of dust exploded from the ground, just in front of the diving man's hand. "I wouldn't," Amos said, his voice cold as a winter creek. The man froze, his hand hovering over the stock of his rifle. Defeated, he slowly stood up, his hands in the air. "Drop your gun belts," Rip ordered. "Slow and easy. Then start walking back to town. Tell Vane his new tax has been repealed." The four men, disarmed and humiliated, did as they were told, stumbling away down the canyon. "That was too easy," Amos said, watching them go. "They're just the grunts," Rip said. "The real trouble will be further up." He was right. As they moved deeper into the hills, they heard the sound of gunfire. Not a single shot, but a running battle. They crested a ridge and saw it. A larger group of Vane's men, maybe 6 or 7 of them, had cornered 2 prospectors in a rocky draw. The prospectors were firing back, but they were pinned down, their situation hopeless. "This is the real fight," Rip said. "They won't run so easy." He laid out a quick, brutal plan. "Amos, you and I will hit them from the flank. Jeb, Sam, you stay here. Lay down a covering fire. Make them think they're being attacked by a bigger force. Keep their heads down." Rip and Amos slid down the back of the ridge, circling wide. The gunfight in the draw grew more intense. They could hear the prospectors' shots becoming less frequent. They were running out of ammunition. They came up on the claim jumpers from the side, catching them completely by surprise. Rip and Amos opened fire, a coordinated volley that sent the attackers scrambling for new cover. One of Vane's men went down, clutching his shoulder. Another dropped his rifle and ran. The fight turned into a chaotic, running battle through the rocks and pines. Rip moved with a deadly grace, firing, moving, reloading, always keeping the enemy off balance. He saw a gunman, taking aim at Jeb's position on the ridge. Rip fired from the hip, a snapshot that was more instinct than aim. The gunman cried out and disappeared behind a boulder. The claim jumpers, caught between 2 fires and led by a man who was no strategist, began to break. They were bullies, not soldiers. They fell back, retreating up the rocky slope. Amos saw an opening. "I can cut them off," he yelled to Rip, and broke cover, running to a higher position that would give him a clear line of fire on their escape route. It was a brave move. And a costly one. One of Vane's men, retreating up the slope, turned and fired a last desperate shot. The bullet caught Amos high in the leg. The old soldier grunted, his leg buckling beneath him, and he went down hard, his rifle skittering across the rocks. Rip saw him fall. A cold fury surged through him. He stood up from behind his cover, exposing himself completely, and brought his Winchester to his shoulder. He fired 3 shots, fast and deliberate. 1, 2, 3. The man who had shot Amos was thrown backward. The last 2 claim jumpers dropped their weapons and fled into the hills. The battle was over. The silence that fell was broken only by Amos's low-pained groan. Rip and Sam rushed to his side. The bullet had gone clean through the fleshy part of his thigh, but he was bleeding badly. They got him back to town as dusk was falling, half carrying him, his face pale and beaded with sweat. They had won the skirmish. They had scattered Vane's men for now. But as Rip looked at his small, battered posse, 1 old man, 1 boy, and now his most capable fighter badly wounded, he knew they couldn't keep this up. Vane had more men. More guns. They had won the day with skill and surprise, but Vane would just send more wolves tomorrow. They were outgunned. And they were running out of time. Rip's gaze drifted down the muddy street, past the Golden Horn, to the small, dark, quiet shop at the end of the road. The gunsmith's shop. Old Ezra Tate's place. A man who, they said, kept to himself. A man who, Rip suddenly realized, might be their last and only hope He turned to Jeb. "Help Sarah get him patched up," he said, his voice grim. "I've got to go see a man about some rifles." Chapter 12. The bell above the door of Tate's gunsmithing made a thin, lonely sound in the dusty air. The shop was quiet, too quiet for a boomtown. A few shotguns rested on a wall rack, and a glass case held a couple of Colt revolvers, but the place had the feel of a museum, not a business. It smelled of gun oil, old wood, and something else, fear. An old man with a leather apron and spectacles perched on the end of his nose looked up from the workbench where he was meticulously cleaning a rifle lock. His hands, though gnarled with age, moved with a watchmaker's precision. He saw Rip Campbell standing in his doorway, and the life seemed to drain out of his face, leaving behind a gray, papery weariness. "We're closed," the old man said, his voice a dry rustle. "Shop door was open," Rip said, stepping inside and letting the door swing shut behind him. "You Ezra Tate?" "I am," the man said, putting down his tools with a reluctance that suggested he wished he could hide behind them. "And I know who you are. You're the man with the $500 bounty on his head. I don't want your trouble in my shop." "The trouble's already in this town, Ezra," Rip said, his voice quiet. "It's in the street. It's in the saloon. It's beating prospectors in alleys and running them off their claims." He paused. "It's got your nephew, Sam, square in its sights." Ezra flinched at the mention of his nephew. He took off his spectacles and began polishing them with a rag, his hands not quite steady. "Sam is a fool boy with gold fever. He should have stayed back east." "He didn't," Rip said. "He's here. And he's standing with us. We took a stand against some of Vane's claim jumpers today. Drove them off. But one of our men, Amos Cole, took a bullet in the leg for his trouble." "I heard the shooting," Ezra said, not looking up from his spectacles. "We're outgunned," Rip stated, cutting to the heart of it. "Vane has a dozen hired guns, maybe more now with the new arrivals from Deadwood. We've got a handful of men with pistols and old hunting rifles. It's not a fair fight." "No fight with Cyrus Vane is ever fair," Ezra whispered. "That's the point of it." "I need rifles, Ezra," Rip said, his voice flat. "Repeating rifles. And ammunition. I'll pay what I can." Ezra finally stopped polishing his glasses. He looked at Rip, his eyes full of a deep ancient weariness. "And where do you think I'd get a supply of repeating rifles? Vane controls every shipment that comes into this town. He sees the manifest on every freight wagon. If I had a crate of Henrys, he'd know about it before I did." "I heard a story," Rip said, leaning against the counter, his voice casual, "about a shipment that came in 6 months ago, before Vane had his hooks in quite so deep. A government contract that got misplaced. A crate of brand new Sharps carbines that never made it to the fort they were bound for." Ezra went very still. The color drained from his face again. He looked toward the door, as if expecting Bull Ramsey to come crashing through it. "That's a fool story. A rumor." "Is it?" Rip asked softly. "Because the man who told it to me was a freighter I shared a bottle with in Cheyenne. He said he delivered that crate right to this shop. Said he was paid in cash by a gunsmith who was worried about an Indian uprising that never came. Said the guns disappeared into this shop and were never seen again." Ezra sank onto his stool, the fight going out of him. He looked old, fragile, a man trapped by a secret he was too afraid to keep and too afraid to let go of. "He'll kill me," Ezra whispered. "If Vane finds out, he'll burn my shop to the ground with me inside it." "He might do that anyway," Rip said, his voice without pity. "Vane's not the kind of man who likes loose ends. And a gunsmith who knows how to arm a town is a loose end." He let that sink in. "Your nephew, Sam. He believes in what we're doing." He stood up, in the saloon. He's working day and night to help Sarah Miles build her store. He's a good kid. He deserves a chance to see what it's all for." The old gunsmith stared at his own hands, at the hands that knew the intricate secrets of steel and wood but were trembling with fear. He thought of his sister's boy, of the hopeful letters Sam had sent home, full of dreams of gold and a new life. He thought of Cyrus Vane's cold, dead eyes. He was caught between two terrible fears. After a long, heavy silence, he let out a sigh that seemed to carry the weight of his entire life. "The nights are getting colder," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "A man needs to bring in his winter firewood." It was the only sign of concession Rip would get. They waited until the Golden Horn was at its loudest, the tinny piano and drunken shouts spilling out into the muddy street. The moon was a thin, silver sliver, offering little light. Rip, Jeb, and Ezra met in the alley behind the gunsmith's shop. "Stay in the shadows," Rip commanded. "We move fast, and we don't make a sound." Ezra led them into the back of his shop, to a corner piled high with old canvases and broken wagon wheels. He and Jeb moved the heavy debris aside, revealing a section of the floor where the planks looked newer than the rest. Ezra took a pry bar and worked a board loose, then another. Beneath them was a long, heavy wooden crate, its sides stenciled with the markings of the U.S. Army. It was heavy. It took all three of them to haul it out of the hole and into the alley. Carrying it was a slow, agonizing process. The crate was awkward, its weight shifting with every step. They moved through the back alleys of Buffalo Run, a trio of ghosts carrying a coffin full of rebellion. They were halfway to Sarah's store when they heard it. The sound of boots slogging through the mud. A low laugh. One of Vane's patrols. "Down," Rip hissed. They dropped the crate behind a stack of empty rain barrels, the thud muffled by the soft earth. They pressed themselves into the shadows as two of Vane's men rounded the corner. The men were sharing a bottle, their talk loud and careless. They stopped not 10 feet from where Rip and the others were hiding, one of them leaning against the very barrels that concealed them. Rip's hand rested on the butt of his Colt. Jeb held his breath, his eyes squeezed shut. Ezra was shaking like a leaf in the wind. The seconds stretched into an eternity. "Come on," one of the men said, taking the bottle. "Let's go check the other side of town. It's too damn quiet over here." They laughed and moved on, their footsteps receding into the night. Rip, Jeb, and Ezra waited until the sound was completely gone. They picked up their heavy burden and finished the journey, their hearts pounding. They slipped into the back of Sarah's half-built store, setting the crate down with a collective, shuddering sigh of relief. Sarah was there, along with Amos and Sam, their faces pale in the single lantern's glow. "Did you get them?" Sarah whispered. Rip didn't answer. He took a crowbar from a nearby toolbox, jammed it under the lid of the crate, and put his weight into it. The wood groaned, nails screamed, and the lid popped open. They all peered inside. There, nestled in a bed of straw, lay a dozen brand-new Sharps carbines, their wooden stocks gleaming, their blued steel barrels radiating a cold, deadly promise. It was the most beautiful sight they had ever seen. Chapter 13. Mr. Vane requests your presence. The man who delivered the message was Vane's bartender. He stood in the doorway of Sarah's half-built store, looking like a man who'd been sent to invite a wolf to dinner. He wouldn't look Rip in the eye. He just stared at a point on the wall somewhere over Rip's shoulder. "He wishes to discuss a business proposition," the bartender added, his voice thin and nervous. Rip was cleaning one of the new Sharps carbines, the gun's oiled steel parts spread out on a canvas sheet. He didn't stop his work. "Vane wants to talk. He knows where to find me." "He has requested you come to the Golden Horn," the bartender insisted, sweat beading on his upper lip. "He said to tell you, He prefers to conduct business in a civilized setting. Jeb Hawkins snorted from a corner where he was sorting ammunition. Civilized? The Golden Horn is about as civilized as a dogfight. Rip carefully set a lever screw on the canvas. He looked up at the bartender, his eyes flat and cold. The man flinched. "All right," Rip said, standing up. "I'll go hear what he has to say." Amos Cole stepped forward, his hand resting on the butt of his pistol. "You're not going alone." "Yes, I am," Rip said. "This isn't a fight." "Not yet. It's a conversation. More than one man walks in there, he'll think we're looking to start something." He picked up his Colt from a nearby crate and slid it into his holster. And he'd be right. He walked out into the muddy street. The town seemed to be holding its breath. Faces peered from behind curtains. Men stopped their work to watch him pass. He was the man with the bounty on his head, walking willingly into the lion's den. The Golden Horn was quiet. Vane had cleared it out. The piano was silent. The long mahogany bar was empty. Cyrus Vane sat alone at his usual back table, a bottle of wine and 2 clean glasses before him. Bull Ramsey stood behind him, his arms crossed, his newly broken nose a swollen purple mess. 2 other hard-faced men Rip didn't recognize stood near the door. The trap was set. Rip walked across the empty room, his boot heels echoing on the floorboards. He stopped in front of Vane's table, but didn't sit. "You wanted to see me," Rip said. "Mr. Campbell," Vane said, his voice smooth and welcoming. He gestured to the empty chair. "Please, join me. A glass of wine?" "I'm not thirsty," Rip said. Vane smiled, a thin, controlled expression. "A man of business. I can appreciate that. Let us get to it, then." He leaned forward, his voice dropping. "You have caused me a great deal of trouble. You have interfered with my employees, damaged my property, and disrupted the delicate economy of this town. You are a problem. Your employees were bullying prospectors and trying to burn a woman's livelihood to the ground," Rip said. "Some people might see that as the problem." "Perspective is everything," Vane said with a wave of his hand. "My perspective is that you are an impediment to progress. And I am a man who believes in removing impediments." He steepled his fingers, looking at Rip with the cool appraisal of a man buying a horse. "But I am also a pragmatist. A war is costly, bad for business. So I am prepared to make you an offer." He reached into his coat and pulled out a thick envelope, placing it on the table. $500, he said. "The price on your own head. It's yours. All you have to do is get on your horse and ride away. Never come back. There will be another 500 waiting for you, with the station master in Cheyenne when you get there. $1,000 to go back to doing what you do best. Drifting." Rip looked at the envelope, then back at Vane. He didn't even consider it. "You think you can buy me off like one of your cheap gunslingers?" "I think a man like you always has a price," Vane said confidently. "You live by the gun. You drift with the wind. You have no loyalty to this place or these people." "You're wrong," Rip said. "I've developed a real fondness for it." He leaned forward, placing his hands on the table, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous growl. "And I'll tell you something else. You don't run this town, Vane. Your fear runs it. You're so afraid of losing your grip, of another man making a dollar you don't control, that you have to hire men like him," he jerked his head toward Ramsey, "to do your dirty work. You're a coward, Vane. A bully hiding behind hired guns and back-alley threats." Vane's calm facade finally cracked. A flicker of cold, reptilian fury showed in his eyes. He gave Bull Ramsey a look. It was all the order the big man needed. Ramsey roared and lunged, his huge hands reaching for Rip's throat. Rip moved like lightning. He sidestepped the clumsy charge, letting Ramsey's own momentum carry him past. As the big man stumbled, Rip grabbed a full whiskey bottle from the table. He didn't swing it. He pivoted, bringing the bottle around in a short, brutal arc and smashing it over the back of Ramsey's head. The bottle exploded, showering Ramsey in whiskey and glass. The big man grunted, his eyes rolling back, and he crashed face first onto the floor, out cold for the second time in a week. The two men by the door went for their guns. Rip was already moving. He kicked the table over, sending Vane and his wine sprawling, and dove behind the long mahogany bar just as the room erupted in gunfire. Splinters flew from the bar as bullets slammed into the wood. Rip came up with his Colt, firing twice over the top of the bar. One of the gunmen yelped and staggered back, clutching his arm. Rip ducked down again as a shotgun blast from the second man tore a huge hole in the wall behind him, showering him with plaster. He crawled along the floor behind the bar, whiskey and broken glass crunching beneath him. He knew he couldn't stay there. He was trapped. He saw the window behind the bar, the one that looked out onto the muddy side alley. It was his only way out. He took a deep breath, kicked a case of empty beer bottles to create a diversion, and then launched himself backward. He crashed through the window in an explosion of shattering glass and splintered wood, landing hard in the filthy mud of the alley. He came up, ignoring the searing pain from a dozen new cuts, and scrambled to his feet. He peered back through the broken window. He saw Vane, his fine suit ruined, his face a mask of pure, uncontrolled rage. His saloon was a wreck. His men were wounded or unconscious. And Rip Campbell was gone. Vane, shaking with fury, swept a row of glasses from the bar with a furious roar, the sound of shattering glass echoing in the ruined, silent room. The conversation was over. The war had begun. Chapter 14. You're a fool, Henderson. Campbell's going to get us all killed. The speaker was a portly merchant who ran the freight office, his face pale with fear. He stood in the muddy street, arguing with the same prospector who had been run off his claim a day earlier. He's the only reason we're not all licking Vane's boots for the privilege of handing over our own gold, Henderson shot back, his voice ringing with a newfound defiance. So you've got to ask yourself, Miller, are you hiding behind your counter with Vane, or are you standing out here with us? That was the question that had split Buffalo Run down the middle. After the showdown at the saloon, you could feel the change in the air. The town was no longer just a collection of individuals trying to get rich. It was two armed camps, separated by a street of mud and a river of fear. Sarah Miles' store, still smelling of fresh-cut pine, had become the nerve center of the rebellion. It was more than just a place to buy supplies at a fair price. It was a meeting hall, a fortress, a symbol. Prospectors gathered there, their talk no longer just of gold, but of rights, of standing together, of drawing a line in the dirt. They came to stand with the woman who had refused to be burned out, and the man who had refused to be bought. The Golden Horn, on the other hand, had become a den of shadows. The easy laughter was gone, replaced by the quiet, watchful paranoia of Vane's loyalists and the men too scared to pick a side. Vane's hired guns, now led by a vengeful and permanently disfigured Bull Ramsey, watched everyone, their hands never far from their pistols. Rip Campbell saw the divide every time he stepped outside. He saw men who would meet his gaze with a nod of respect, and others who would hurry across the street to avoid him, terrified of being associated with the man who had a $500 bounty on his head. The tension was a coiled spring, and Cyrus Vane, a man who understood pressure better than anyone, decided it was time to squeeze. The move came quietly, without a single gunshot. It was Sam Tate who discovered it, running into Sarah's store with a look of panic on his face. "It's the well," he gasped. "Vane's men. They're guarding the town well. They won't let anyone near it." Rip, Amos, and Jeb exchanged a look. It was a classic siege tactic, as old as warfare itself. Vane couldn't stop them from trading, not without looking like an open tyrant. So he would choke them out. No water for the people, no water for their animals. In the relentless heat of the Dakota summer, he'd given them 3 days, maybe 4, before they would have to surrender or die of thirst. "He's declared war on all of us now," Sarah said, her voice tight with anger. "Not just you, Rip. Anyone who does business with me." "He's left us no choice," Amos said, his voice a low growl. "We have to hit him back." That night, under the cover of a moonless, star-pricked sky, Rip led a small raiding party. It was just him, Amos, and Jeb. Sam was tasked with organizing every man, woman, and child at the store with buckets, barrels, anything that could hold water ready for the signal. They moved through the back alleys, 3 shadows in a town that felt like it was holding its breath. The main well was in a small square behind the livery stable. 4 of Vane's men were posted as guards. They weren't expecting trouble. They were laughing and passing a bottle, their rifles leaning against the wellhouse wall. It was sloppy. Rip laid out the plan in a series of harsh whispers. "Jeb, you circle around to the far side. When the fight starts, you get those rifles. Don't let them reach their long guns. Amos, you and I take the 2 on the left. We move fast, and we move quiet. No shooting, unless we have to." They moved in. Rip came up behind the first guard, a big man who was in the middle of telling a dirty joke. The man never heard him. Rip's arm snaked around his throat, cutting off the punchline, while the butt of his Colt came down hard on the man's temple. The guard slumped to the ground without a sound. Amos was just as efficient, disabling his man with a brutal chop to the side of the neck. The other 2 guards, seeing their companions drop, scrambled for their pistols. One of them, a young kid with more bravado than sense, managed to get his gun clear of the holster. He aimed it at Rip. Jeb, who had secured the rifles, saw the move. "Rip, look out," he yelled. The kid fired, the shot a deafening roar in the night. The bullet tore a splinter from the wellhouse frame, inches from Rip's head. Rip didn't hesitate. He fired back. 1 shot. The kid grunted, a look of profound surprise on his face, and then he crumpled to the ground, his pistol falling from his hand. He lay still. A dead quiet fell over the square, broken only by the groans of the man Amos had taken down. They had crossed a line. This was no longer a brawl or a duel. A man was dead. There was no going back. "Signal them," Rip ordered, his voice grim. Jeb waved a lantern 3 times. A minute later, a human chain of prospectors and townspeople, led by Sarah and Sam, came running from the darkness, their buckets and barrels rattling. They worked in a frantic, desperate silence, filling their containers, their faces illuminated by the flickering lantern light. They had water, enough to last a week. But they had bought it with blood. As they slipped back toward the store, leaving 1 man dead and 2 unconscious in the square, Rip knew Vane's response would be swift and terrible. He now had a body to lay at Rip's feet. He could call him a murderer, not just an outlaw. He could rally the rest of the town against them with a righteous fury. They had won the battle for the well, but they might have just handed Cyrus Vane the excuse he needed to burn them all to the ground. Rip stood guard on the porch of Sarah's store for the rest of the night, watching the street, waiting. The tension was a living thing now, a predator stalking the muddy streets of the divided town. As the first pale light of dawn began to touch the sky, a lone figure appeared at the far end of the street. It was a man on a tired-looking mule, not a horse. He was dressed in dusty black broadcloth, and a heavy Bible was strapped to his saddlebag. He rode slowly into the center of the town, his eyes taking in the silent, watchful windows and the palpable atmosphere of a place on the brink of war. He stopped his mule right between the Golden Horn and Sarah's store, a man of God who had just ridden into a small piece of hell. Chapter 15. You look lost, Reverend. This ain't the kind of place a man comes looking for God. The man on the tired mule turned his head. He had a long, gaunt face, a beard streaked with gray, and eyes that burned with a fire that had nothing to do with gold fever. He looked at Jeb Hawkins, who had spoken, and then his gaze swept the muddy street, taking in the sullen silence of the Golden Horn and the defiant, fortress-like quality of Sarah Miles' half-built store. Sometimes, son, the preacher said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble, a man doesn't have to look for God. Sometimes he's sent to find the devil. He swung a leg over his mule, his dusty black coat swirling around him. My name is Holt. Reverend Holt. And the Lord tells me this town is choking on its own greed. He didn't seek shelter or ask for a drink. He walked to the center of the street, right on the invisible line that divided the town, and he began to preach. His voice wasn't the sing-song of a back east minister. It was the raw, powerful roar of an Old Testament prophet. He spoke of Sodom and Gomorrah, of judgment and fire, of the false idols of gold and power. He didn't take a side. He condemned them all, his words a lash on the guilty conscience of Buffalo Run. The townsfolk, drawn by the spectacle, watched from a distance. Vane's men looked on from the porch of the saloon with amused contempt. But Rip, watching from the doorway of Sarah's store, saw something else. He saw a man with no fear. Later that day, Holt sought him out. The preacher carried a battered Bible in one hand and an air of grim purpose. He found Rip reinforcing one of the store's window frames. You're the one they call Campbell, Holt said. It wasn't a question. Rip drove a nail home with 2 clean strikes of his hammer. That's what they call me. I've been watching you, the preacher said, his fiery eyes appraising Rip. You fight like a man who has made his peace with violence. But you fight for the sheep, not for the wolves. It's a contradiction. He paused, his gaze becoming distant. I have seen your enemy before. Rip stopped his work. He turned to face the preacher. You know Vane? I know the man he was, Holt corrected. His name wasn't Vane then. It was Corman. Major Alistair Corman. He was a quartermaster during the war. A sutler. He sold shoddy goods to both sides at twice the price. Made a fortune off the blood of boys in blue and gray alike. The preacher's face darkened with the memory. But that wasn't enough for him. Profit wasn't enough. He liked the chaos. The destruction. Holt's voice dropped lower, the memory a ghost in his eyes. I was a chaplain with the 3rd Cavalry. We came upon a town in Missouri. Or what was left of it. A supply depot. The whole town around it burned to the ground. They called it a rebel raid. But it wasn't. It was Corman. He had a warehouse full of grain he couldn't sell. So he burned the depot to create a shortage, then sold his own stock to the army for 10 times its worth. He burned a town full of people for a ledger book. The story settled in the air, cold and heavy. It explained everything. The fires. The callous disregard for human life. Cyrus Vane wasn't just a saloon boss. He was a man who saw people as entries in a ledger to be erased for profit. How do you know it was him? Rip asked. Because I found a survivor, Holt said, his voice tight. A boy, hiding in a cellar. He saw the man who lit the first fire. A man in a fine suit who just stood there and smiled while the town burned. Holt looked at Rip. Your man Vane. He has that same smile. Reverend Holt set up a small, meager camp at the edge of town on a patch of neutral ground. That evening, he came back to the store. He didn't preach. He just shared their simple meal of beans and coffee. He offered a prayer, not for victory, but for courage. His presence, his quiet, unshakable faith, was a strange comfort to the small band of rebels. He was a reminder that they were fighting for something more than just their claims or their lives. They were fighting against a fundamental wickedness. The retaliation came after dark. Rip was on watch when he saw them. 3 of Vane's men, including the hulking shape of Bull Ramsey, creeping toward Holt's camp. Rip raised his rifle, but they weren't approaching like killers. This was something else. They swarmed the preacher's small tent. They didn't touch Holt, who was inside. They just destroyed his camp. They kicked over his coffee pot, poured his water barrel into the dust, and slashed his tent with their knives until it was nothing but ribbons of canvas. And then, in a final act of sneering, pointless cruelty, Ramsey took the preacher's heavy Bible, ripped the pages from its spine, and scattered them like confetti in the mud. Then they laughed and swaggered back to the saloon. When they were gone, Rip and the others went to the ruined camp. Holt was kneeling in the dirt, trying to gather the torn, mud-stained pages of his Bible. His face was not angry. It was filled with a profound and terrible sorrow. Rip looked at the desecrated pages, at the words of Scripture trampled into the filth. He wasn't a religious man. He didn't know Leviticus from a poker hand. But he knew the difference between a fight and an act of pure, blasphemous spite. Vane hadn't just attacked a rival. He had attacked the idea of decency itself. He had declared war on the soul of the town. Rip's vow, when he made it, was not loud. It was a quiet, deadly promise to himself and the old preacher kneeling in the mud. This was no longer about claims or monopolies. This was about justice. He looked toward the Golden Horn, its lights a garish stain on the darkness. He thought of Vane sitting inside, counting his money, secure behind his walls and his hired guns. He thought of the stories of burned towns and war profiteering. Vane wasn't just a man anymore. He was a disease. He turned to Amos and Jeb, who were standing beside him, their faces tight with rage. "He doesn't care about men," Rip said, his voice cold as a stone. "He doesn't care about God. He only cares about one thing." His eyes narrowed, a new, audacious, and incredibly dangerous plan forming in his mind. He looked straight at the brightly lit saloon. His gold. And we're going to take it from him. Chapter 16. You want to do what? Jeb Hawkins stared at Rip, as if the man had just suggested they try to fly. They were gathered in the back room of Sarah's store, the air thick with the smell of sawdust and lamp oil. "You heard me," Rip said. He was tracing a crude map of the Golden Horn's layout in a patch of spilled flour on a barrelhead. "We're going to walk into Vane's saloon, open his safe, and walk out with every ounce of gold he has." "Just like that," Amos Cole said, his voice flat. It wasn't a question. It was a statement of disbelief. "While Bull Ramsey and a dozen other gunslingers are watching the door." "They won't be watching the door," Rip said, wiping the flour from his hands. "They'll be too busy fighting." He laid out the plan. It was simple. It was audacious. It was insane. Rip and Sam, disguised as a couple of loud, sloppy drunks, would provide the initial distraction. Jeb and Amos would start the main event, a full-scale bar fight designed to pull every eye in the room. In the chaos, Rip and Sam would slip into Vane's back office, crack the safe, and be gone before the dust settled. "The safe's the problem," Amos said, ever the pragmatist. "That's a new model from back east. A D-bolt. You can't open that with a stick of dynamite without bringing the whole building down." "You don't need dynamite if you've got a good ear," Rip said quietly. Jeb's eyes widened. Don't tell me you're a damn safecracker on top of everything else. I spent a winter in a territorial prison in Kansas once, Rip said, his face giving away nothing. You get bored. You learn things. He looked at Sam, whose face was a mixture of terror and pure, unadulterated excitement. You think you can act drunk, kid? I guess so, Sam stammered. Don't guess, Rip said. And don't overdo it. Just be loud, clumsy, and stupid. It shouldn't be too much of a stretch. He turned to Jeb and Amos. You two just have to pick a fight. Find the biggest, dumbest-looking Vane loyalist you can and insult his mother. The rest should take care of itself. An hour later, the plan was in motion. Rip and Sam stumbled through the bat-wing doors of the Golden Horn. Sam had his shirt untucked and had splashed some whiskey on it for effect. Rip just looked like himself, only looser, his movements exaggerated. He bumped into a table, sloshing a miner's beer. Watch it, you damn fool, the miner snarled. My apologies, friend, Rip said with a loud, sloppy grin, throwing an arm around the man's shoulder. A man ought to be allowed a little celebration. The boy here just struck the mother lode. He pulled Sam forward, who grinned weakly. The ruse drew a few annoyed glances, but nothing more. They made their way to the bar, ordered whiskeys they didn't intend to drink much of, and continued to be loud and obnoxious. Across the room, Jeb and Amos took their positions near a table where three of Vane's men were playing cards. One of them was Hackett, the red-faced man Rip had knocked out in the first brawl. His jaw was still bruised. Jeb watched the man lose a hand, then leaned in. You play cards about as well as you take a punch, Hackett, he said, his voice carrying. Hackett's head snapped up, his eyes narrowing. What did you say, old man? I said, Jeb repeated, enunciating every word, that I've seen smarter mules. And prettier ones, too. That was all it took. Hackett roared and shoved the table over, sending cards and chips flying. Amos, as if on cue, threw a punch that caught one of the other men square in the nose. The saloon erupted. It was a chain reaction of pent-up aggression and cheap whiskey. Within seconds, 20 men were throwing fists, chairs, and bottles. Cyrus Vane, who had been sitting at his back table, stood up, his face a mask of cold fury at the chaos consuming his establishment. Bull Ramsey moved to his side, roaring for order, but it was too late. The riot was on. In the confusion, no one saw Rip grab Sam and pull him toward the back of the room. No one saw them slip through the door marked "Private" that led to Vane's office. The office was quiet, insulated from the roar of the brawl outside. It was richly appointed, with a thick carpet and a heavy oak desk. And against the far wall, squat and black and immovable, was the Diebold safe. Get the door, Rip whispered. Sam wedged a chair under the doorknob. Rip was already kneeling in front of the safe, pulling a small, delicate tool that looked like a doctor's stethoscope from his pocket. He pressed the listening cup to the cold steel door and began to turn the dial, his touch as gentle as a lover's. He closed his eyes, his world shrinking to the faint metallic sounds coming through the earpiece. The roar of the fight outside was a distant ocean. He heard the tumblers, tiny clicks in a universe of silence. Click. The first one fell into place. He reversed the dial. He was sweating now, the tension a physical thing. Click. The second tumbler. A heavy thud against the office door made them both jump. Someone was trying the handle. Mr. Vane wants to know what's going on in there, a voice shouted. Go away. Sam yelled, his voice cracking. Private meeting. Rip ignored it all. He was lost in the intricate mechanics of the lock. He turned the dial again, slower this time, listening, feeling. Click. The third. He let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding, and turned the heavy steel handle. The door swung open with a soft, well-oiled sigh. Inside were dozens of heavy leather sacks, all of them bulging. Rip grabbed two, tossing two more to Sam. The gold was heavy, a solid back-breaking weight. "The window," Rip grunted. They hauled the sacks to the back window that overlooked the alley. As Rip was pushing it open, he glanced back into the saloon through the office doorway. Through the swirling dust and chaos of the brawl, he saw Cyrus Vane. Vane's fastest gun was not fighting. He was sitting at a corner table, his shattered arm in a sling, a bottle of whiskey before him. He was watching the office door, his eyes cold and intelligent. As Rip watched, Vane's gaze lifted, and for a split second their eyes met across the room. Vane saw the open safe behind Rip. He saw the sacks of gold. He couldn't stop them, but he saw them. Rip didn't wait. He and Sam scrambled out the window, dropping into the muddy alley. They ran, their lungs burning, the heavy sacks of gold bouncing painfully against their backs. They didn't stop until they were clear of the town, disappearing into the dark, rocky hills. They found the small, abandoned prospector's dugout they had chosen earlier and stashed the gold deep inside, covering the entrance with brush. They had done it. They had stolen Cyrus Vane's heart and hidden it in the hills. Back in the Golden Horn, the brawl was dying down. Vane, his face a thunderclap, stormed into his ruined office. He saw the open, empty safe. He saw the muddy tracks leading to the open window. He walked back out into the saloon. Cyrus Vane was still sitting at his table. He looked up as Vane approached. "They went out the back," Vane said, his voice flat. He nodded his head toward the hills. Headed north. The drifter and the boy. Vane looked at Bull Ramsey, who was just now staggering to his feet, his face a bloody mess. "Get every man you can find," Vane ordered, his voice a low, deadly whisper. "I want my gold back. And I want Campbell's head in a bag." Chapter 17. "They're gaining on us, Rip. I can hear their horses." Sam Tate's voice was a ragged gasp, torn from his lungs by the frantic gallop. The heavy sack of gold bounced cruelly against his back, each jolt a fresh reminder of the weight of their crime. The narrow canyon walls rose up on either side of them, a claustrophobic trap of red rock and shadow, echoing the thunder of their own flight and the closer, more menacing thunder of the pursuit. "Don't look back," Rip grunted, his own breathing coming in hard, measured bursts. "Looking back gets you killed. Just ride." He risked a glance himself. 4 riders. Cyrus Vane was in the lead, his wounded arm strapped tight to his body, his face a pale mask of fury in the moonlight. He was pushing his horse hard, fueled by a humiliation that was more potent than any whiskey. A gunshot cracked, the sound unnaturally loud in the confined space. A bullet whined past Rip's ear and slammed into the rock face ahead, showering them with stone fragments. "Get down low," Rip yelled, hunching over Sandy's neck. They rounded a sharp bend in the canyon, gaining a few seconds of reprieve. The path ahead was choked with boulders, forcing them to slow their pace. It was a bad spot. A place to get cornered. "In there!" Rip shouted, pointing to a narrow split in the canyon wall, little more than a deep fissure. "Now." They swerved their horses into the tight space, dismounting in a scramble. The fissure was a dead end, a rock-walled box canyon no more than 50 feet deep. They were trapped. "We're trapped," Sam said, his eyes wide with panic as he hauled the sacks of gold from his horse. "We were trapped out there too," Rip said, his voice calm. He pulled his Winchester from its scabbard. "This is just a smaller trap. Gives them less room to maneuver." He peered around the edge of the rock. Vane and his men had reined in at the mouth of the fissure, staying just out of sight. They weren't stupid. They knew they had their prey cornered. "What do we do?" Sam whispered, his voice trembling. Rip looked at the boy. He saw the fear, but underneath it a flicker of something else. A desperate, stubborn resolve. "You got anything in that saddlebag besides your dreams, kid?" Sam's eyes lit up with a sudden memory. He fumbled with his saddlebag, pulling out a small oilcloth-wrapped bundle. "Jeb gave me this. From a prospector's kit we bought. Said you never know when you might need to move a little rock." He unrolled the bundle. Inside were 3 sticks of dynamite and a coil of fuse with blasting caps. Rip looked at the dynamite, then at the steep, unstable cliff face above the entrance to their small sanctuary. A slow, dangerous idea began to form in his mind. "Give it to me," he said. He took one of the sticks, his hands working with a deft, practiced speed that made Sam's eyes go wide. He cut a short length of fuse, crimped a cap onto the end, and inserted it into the soft, waxy stick. "They're coming," Sam hissed, peering around the rock. Rip saw them. Kane was sending 2 of his men in on foot, creeping forward from boulder to boulder, while he and the 4th man provided covering fire. It was a classic infantry tactic. "All right, kid," Rip said, handing the stick of dynamite to Sam. "Here's the plan. I'm going to make them keep their heads down. You're going to climb. See that ledge up there? The one with the loose rocks?" Sam looked up. It was a 20-foot climb, almost sheer rock. "I can't." "Yes, you can," Rip said, his voice hard as nails. "You get up there, you find a good spot, and you wedge the stick deep into a crack right above the entrance. When I give the signal, you light the fuse. You got that?" Before Sam could answer, a volley of shots erupted from Kane's men. Bullets sparked and ricocheted around their small space. Rip shoved Sam toward the rock face. "Go. Now." Rip stepped out from behind cover, his colt barking. He wasn't trying to hit anyone. He was trying to draw their fire, to make them keep their heads down. He fired twice at the rocks where Kane's men were hiding, then ducked back as a hail of lead answered him. He risked a glance up. Sam was climbing, his fingers and boots finding small, desperate holds in the rock. He was halfway up, the stick of dynamite clenched in his teeth. "That's it, kid," Rip muttered to himself. He fired again, providing another few seconds of cover. Sam reached the ledge. He scrambled onto it, his chest heaving. He found a deep crack in the rock face, just as Rip had said, and shoved the dynamite deep inside. He pulled a match from his pocket, his hands shaking so badly it took him 3 tries to strike it. Down below, Kane's men were getting bolder, advancing from rock to rock. They were almost at the entrance. "Sam, light it," Rip roared. Sam got the match lit. He touched the sputtering flame to the end of the fuse. It caught, spitting a shower of angry sparks. Rip holstered his Colt and began to scramble back deeper into the dead-end fissure. "Get back," he yelled at Sam. The fuse burned with a terrifying speed. Kane, seeing the sputtering light from above, finally realized what was happening. "Back," he screamed at his men. "Get back." It was too late. The dynamite exploded with a deafening, gut-punching roar. For a second, nothing happened. Then, with a deep, grinding groan, the entire cliff face above the entrance seemed to liquefy. A tidal wave of rock, dust, and boulders plunged downward, a man-made avalanche that completely sealed the mouth of the fissure, burying the 2 advancing gunmen under tons of granite. The canyon fell silent, the air thick with choking dust. Rip and Sam were sealed in, but they were alive. They looked at each other in the gloom, their faces pale, their ears ringing. Outside the wall of rock, Silas Kane stared at the impassable rockslide, his face a mask of disbelief and pure, unadulterated hatred. His 2 men were gone. The gold was gone. Campbell was gone, buried alive for all he knew. He looked at his one remaining man. "We're leaving," he said, his voice a low, venomous whisper. He turned his horse, his mind already working, plotting. This wasn't over. It had just become more personal. He would find another way. He would wait. And he would have his revenge. Inside the rock-sealed tomb, Rip looked at the solid wall of stone that blocked their exit. "Well, kid," he said, his voice grim. "Looks like we're gonna have to find another way out." He walked over to the sacks of gold they had fought so hard for, now their only companions in the dark. He picked one up, feeling its immense, solid weight. They had the gold. They had won the battle. And they had buried themselves alive to do it. Chapter 18. "Please don't shoot. It's just me. It's Cal." The voice was a pathetic, broken thing that came out of the darkness beyond the firelight. The prospectors gathered around the fire at Sarah's store jumped to their feet, grabbing for their guns. Rip, who was cleaning one of the new Sharps carbines, didn't move. He just looked up, his face unreadable. Cal Weaver stumbled into the light. He was a wreck. His clothes were torn, his face was bruised and cut, and he walked with a limp that looked genuine. He held his hands up in a gesture of surrender, his shifty eyes wide with a desperate, hunted fear. "I told you what would happen if I saw you again," Rip said, his voice flat. I know," Cal whimpered, collapsing to his knees in the dirt. "But I had nowhere else to go. Vane, after you didn't show up on the North Spur, he knew I'd been found out. He had his men work me over. Said I was useless to him. He threw me out. Said if he saw me again, he'd have Bull Ramsey finish the job." Cal looked around at the hard, unforgiving faces. "I got nowhere to go. I got nothing. Just let me have some water. Maybe a bite to eat. I'll be on my way in the morning, I swear." Jeb Hawkins looked at Rip, his expression torn. "He ain't lying about the beating, Rip. Look at him." "A man can pay a friend to beat him if the price is right," Amos Cole said, his voice a low growl of suspicion. Rip looked down at the pathetic man, kneeling in the dust. He didn't believe a word of it. A snake doesn't change its scales just because you step on its tail. But he saw something else in Cal's eyes, a flicker of purpose behind the fear. Vane hadn't thrown him out. He'd sent him back. "Get him some water," Rip said to Sarah, who looked on with a mixture of pity and distrust. He turned his gaze back to Cal. "You can stay the night. We'll give you food and bind your cuts. But you'll sleep where I can see you. And Amos will be watching you while I'm asleep. You so much as get up to take a piss, you do it with him holding a rifle to your back." "Thank you, Rip," Cal sobbed, his relief so profound it seemed genuine. "You won't regret this. I'll make it up to you. I'll fight with you." "No, you won't," Rip said, turning back to his rifle. "You'll just sit quiet and try not to get yourself killed." Later that night, the camp was quiet. The prospectors, weary from a day of work and tension, were asleep in their bedrolls. Cal was curled up near the fire, a picture of exhausted misery. Amos sat on a crate across from him, his rifle across his lap, his eyes heavy-lidded but alert. Rip was lying in his own bedroll nearby, but he wasn't asleep. He was watching the subtle rhythm of Cal's breathing through slitted eyes. For 2 hours, the man didn't move. Then, when he thought Amos was dozing, when the camp was at its stillest, Cal began to stir. He moved with a slowness, a deliberate care that belied his earlier broken state. He rose to his feet, silent as a puff of smoke, and looked over at Amos, who seemed to be asleep, his chin resting on his chest. Assured, Cal crept away from the fire. He didn't head for the edge of camp. He headed for the back of Sarah's store, where they had carefully stacked the crates of new ammunition for the Sharps carbines. Rip was on his feet an instant later, a shadow detaching itself from the other shadows. He followed, his bare feet making no sound on the hard-packed earth. He found Cal, crouched beside the ammunition crates. The lid on one was already pried open. In Cal's hand was a small tin, and he was carefully, painstakingly opening the paper cartridges one by one, pouring out the good government-issue black powder and replacing it with a fine, useless dust from the tin. Charcoal, probably. The guns would still fire, but the bullets would have no power. They would likely fall out of the end of the barrel. It was the kind of sabotage that wouldn't be discovered until the middle of a firefight. Until it was too late. "That's a neat trick, Cal." Rip's voice came out of the darkness, quiet and cold as a tombstone. Cal yelped, spinning around, the tin of charcoal dust flying from his hand. He saw Rip standing there, and a raw animal panic took over. He didn't beg. He didn't try to explain. He lunged, his fists flailing, trying to fight his way out. The fight was short and ugly. Rip sidestepped Cal's wild swing and drove a hard fist into his stomach, doubling him over with a gasp. As Cal staggered forward, Rip hit him again, a sharp, cracking blow to the side of his jaw that sent him sprawling into the dust. Before Cal could even think of getting up, Rip was on him, hauling him to his feet and slamming him back against the wall of the store, his forearm pressed hard against Cal's throat. "Who sent you?" Rip snarled, his face inches from Cal's. By now, the commotion had woken the camp. Amos and Jeb came running, their guns ready. They saw Rip with Cal pinned against the wall, the open crate of ammunition, the spilled charcoal dust. The picture was sickeningly clear. They dragged him back to the fire and tied him to a support beam of the half-finished store. He was blubbering now, the fight completely gone, replaced by a terrified, pleading hysteria. "He made me do it," Cal cried, tears and snot running down his face. "Vane did. He said if I didn't, he'd have Ramsey gut me and leave me in the hills." "Made you do what?" Amos growled, kicking the man's leg. "Spit it out." "He wanted the rifles out of commission," Cal sobbed. "He knows you're armed now. He knows you're ready for him." The traitor looked up, his eyes wild with terror. "He's coming, Rip. He's coming tonight. He's got the new guns from Deadwood. A dozen of them, at least. He's not sending a raiding party. He's sending an army. He said he's going to burn this whole side of the street to the ground with all of us in it." The confession hung in the cold night air, a death sentence for them all. The time for skirmishes, for raids and duels, was over. Vane was done playing games. He was coming to finish it, once and for all. Rip turned away from the pathetic, weeping traitor. His face was a mask of cold, hard calculation. The final battle was here. He looked at Amos, then at Jeb and Sarah, at the small band of rebels who had put their faith in him. "Get everyone," Rip said, his voice cutting through the terrified silence, sharp and clear as the cocking of a pistol. "Get every gun. Barricade the doors. Board up the windows." He looked toward the dark, silent main street, toward the Golden Horn Saloon. "The war is coming to us." Chapter 19. "Jeb, get those flour sacks. Stack them in the windows, head high. Sam, you and Henderson start boarding up the back. Don't leave a crack big enough for a snake to slip through." Rip's voice cut through the panicked haze that had descended upon the small group of rebels after Cal Weaver's confession. His words were sharp, practical, and devoid of fear. They were the orders of a man who didn't have time for panic. The time for talk was over. The time for work, for a final, desperate stand, had begun. The half-finished general store became a whirlwind of frantic activity. It was no longer a symbol of hope. It was a fortress. Men who had spent their lives digging in the dirt now worked with a grim purpose, their fear channeled into the hard labor of survival. The rhythmic thump of hammers driving nails, the grating screech of saws cutting through pine boards, the grunts of men heaving heavy barrels into place, these were the sounds of their defiance. Sarah Miles was in the center of it all, a general organizing her own unconventional army. She directed men to barricade the front door with overturned ore carts, her voice clear and steady. She had the women tearing sheets into bandages and boiling water, turning a corner of her store into a makeshift infirmary. Her dream of a mercantile was being transformed into a stockade, and she showed no sign of regret, only a cold, hard anger. Ezra Tate, the old gunsmith, had brought the Sharps carbines. He moved among the prospectors, his earlier fear burned away by a new, hotter fire. He was a teacher now, his gnarled hands showing the men how to load the heavy single-shot rifles, how to handle the breech block, how to aim for a spot on a man's chest. "This ain't a scattergun," he told a nervous-looking miner, tapping the long octagonal barrel. "You don't just point it in a direction. You aim it. You breathe out slow, you find your target, and you squeeze the trigger. Don't jerk it. Squeeze it like you're shaking hands with the devil, and you mean to break his fingers." In a quiet corner, away from the frantic hammering, Reverend Holt gathered a few of the older men and the women. He didn't preach a sermon of fire and brimstone now. His voice was quiet, his prayer short and direct, a plea not for miracles, but for something more fundamental. "Lord," he said, his eyes closed, his craggy face illuminated by a single lantern, "we do not ask for you to fight our battles for us. We ask only for the strength to fight them ourselves. Grant these good people a steady hand, a courageous heart, and a righteous anger. For they stand against the wicked. Amen." Rip watched it all, his mind a cold, calculating machine. He knew barricades and prayers weren't enough. He needed to know what was coming. He needed to see Vane's army for himself. He turned to Amos, who was grimly checking a row of pistols. The old soldier's leg was tightly bound, but he stood tall, ready for the fight. "Keep them working," Rip said. "I'm going out. I need to see how many guns he has." "You can't," Amos said, his voice a low protest. "The town will be crawling with Vane's men. They'll see you before you get 100 yards. They'll be watching the street," Rip countered. "They won't be watching the rooftops." Before Amos could argue, Rip was gone, slipping out the back and disappearing into the darkness between the buildings. He moved with a cat-like grace, climbing a rain barrel onto the low roof of the assayer's office, then making a short, dangerous leap across an alley to the flat roof of the mercantile. From there, he crawled on his belly, a shadow among the other shadows, until he reached the edge of the roof overlooking the Golden Horn Saloon. The saloon was lit up like a festival, but the sounds coming from it were not festive. There was no piano music, no drunken laughter. There was only the low, angry hum of men preparing for a fight. And there were more of them than Rip had expected. Many more. He saw the men Vane already had, Ramsey, Hackett, a dozen other familiar thugs. But there were new faces, too. A group of 10 or 12 men were gathered near the front porch, checking their guns. These weren't drunken miners or local bullies. They had the hard, merciless look of professionals. They wore their guns tied down low. They moved with a quiet confidence that spoke of range wars and bloody peril disputes. These were the new guns from Deadwood, bought and paid for by Vane's gold. Rip did a quick, grim count. Vane had more than 20 men. 20 hired killers against his own small band of a dozen prospectors armed with new rifles they barely knew how to use. The odds weren't just bad. They were impossible. He slipped back the way he came, his heart a cold, heavy stone in his chest. He re-entered the store, the noise and the determined energy of his friends a stark contrast to the cold, professional menace he had just witnessed across the street. Amos saw his face and knew. "How bad is it?" he asked, his voice low. Rip looked at the faces around him. He saw Sam, trying to look brave. He saw Jeb, his old eyes full of a grim light. He saw Sarah, her face set and determined. He couldn't lie to them. Not now. "It's worse," Rip said, his voice flat. The hammering stopped. Every eye in the room turned to him. Vane's brought in professionals. Hired guns from Deadwood. He let the silence stretch for a moment. "I counted 15 new rifles. We're outnumbered, at least 2-1. A wave of despair, colder and more potent than the fear had been, washed over the room. A man could fight against bullies. But how could a dozen miners fight an army of professional killers? Rip let them absorb the blow. He let them feel the weight of the impossible odds. Then he walked over to the stack of new Sharps carbines and picked one up. He checked the action, the sound a sharp, definitive click in the sudden silence. "Good thing I'm a better shot than they are," he said, his voice devoid of any boast, a simple statement of fact. He walked to one of the newly barricaded windows, peering out into the night. "Get to your positions. And pray that preacher knows what he's talking about." He didn't have to wait long. As he watched the dark, empty street, a single torch flared to life at the far end of town, held aloft by a rider on a black horse. Then another appeared beside it. And another. A line of fiery lights, stretching from one side of the street to the other, a burning, implacable wave ready to crash down upon them. Chapter 20. Hold your fire. Rip's voice was a low growl, barely audible over the frantic pounding of hearts in the besieged store. Through the narrow slits in the boarded-up windows, they could see the line of torches advancing down the muddy street. It was a slow, deliberate march, an army of fire and shadows coming to burn them out. "They're trying to draw us out," Amos Cole said from his position near the front door. He was propped up against a stack of flour sacks, his wounded legs stretched out before him, a Sharps carbine resting in his lap. His face was pale with pain, but his eyes were clear and hard. "They want us to waste our ammunition on shadows. Then we wait for the whites of their eyes," Rip said. The attackers came closer. They weren't yelling. The professionals Vane had hired from Deadwood were quiet, moving with a grim purpose. They fanned out, taking cover behind the buildings across the street, laying down a disciplined, withering fire against the storefront. Bullets slammed into the new pine walls, splintering the wood, shattering the last remaining panes of glass. Then the local thugs, led by Bull Ramsey, made their charge. They came running through the gunfire, roaring and brandishing their torches, their goal to get close enough to set the building ablaze. "Now!" Rip yelled. The store erupted in a deafening roar of its own. The big Sharps carbines in the hands of the determined prospectors answered the attack. The heavy slugs punched through the darkness with authority. One of the torchbearers went down, his torch flying into the air and landing in a puddle with a hiss. Another screamed and clutched his shoulder, scrambling back into the darkness. But more kept coming. A torch was thrown, landing on the low porch roof and catching the dry wood. Flames began to lick up the side of the wall. The air in the store grew thick with smoke, the heat becoming a palpable presence. "We can't stay in here. He's going to roast us alive," Sam Tate yelled, his voice tight with panic as he fired his own rifle through a loophole. Rip looked at the growing fire, then at the whiskey bottles lining the shelves behind what used to be Sarah's counter. An idea, born of desperation and fire, took hold. "Sarah," he roared over the din. "Your whiskey. All of it. And rags. Rip up some shirts." Sarah didn't question him. She immediately began grabbing bottles of cheap bourbon and rye, her face set in a grim mask. Jeb Hawkins, seeing Rip's intent, grinned a terrible, wolfish grin and started tearing strips from a bolt of cloth. They worked with a frantic speed, stuffing the rags into the necks of the bottles. Improvised firebombs. A poor man's artillery. They won't see this coming, Rip said, grabbing one of the finished cocktails. He looked at Jeb and a couple of the other miners. We're going out. The side door. We hit them from the flank while they're focused on the front. It's suicide, Jeb said, though his eyes gleamed with a wild light. Staying in here is suicide, Rip countered. He looked at Amos. Keep them busy. Amos just nodded, chambering another round into his rifle with a metallic snick. He propped the long barrel on the windowsill and fired, his shot methodical and steady, a rock in the chaotic storm. Rip led his small, desperate party out the side door and into the narrow, dark alley. They crept along the wall of the store, the roar of the gunfight and the crackle of the flames growing louder. They reached the corner of the street. Bull Ramsey was there, directing his men, urging them to throw more torches. Light them, Rip whispered. Jeb struck a match, his hands shaking, and lit the rags on 2 of the bottles. The wicks caught, burning with a greedy orange flame. Now, Rip yelled. He broke from cover, his arm cocked back, and hurled the bottle in a high arc. It sailed through the air, a fiery comet in the night, and shattered against the wall right above Ramsey and his men. A wave of burning whiskey erupted, splashing down over them. Men screamed, their clothes catching fire, their confident roars turning into shrieks of pure terror. They dropped their torches and guns, beating at the flames that clung to them. Jeb and the others threw their own bottles, adding to the chaos, creating a wall of fire and panic right in the middle of Vane's assault. The professional gunmen across the street, seeing the charge break into a fiery, screaming mob, were momentarily stunned. It was the opening Rip needed. Back inside, he yelled. They scrambled back into the store as the attackers, their morale shattered, began to fall back, dragging their burned companions with them. The relentless covering fire from across the street faltered, then stopped altogether as Vane's men realized the raid had failed. The rebels had held. They had won. They beat out the flames on the porch, their faces black with soot, their lungs burning with smoke. The front of Sarah's store was a scorched, bullet-riddled ruin, but it was still standing. 2 of their own had taken bullets, but Doc Chilton, who had been working tirelessly in the back, was already tending to them. The cost had been high, but they had survived the night. Rip stood in the shattered doorway, the warm barrel of his Colt still in his hand, and looked out at the smoldering street. Vane's men were gone, melted back into the darkness. But he knew this wasn't over. Then he saw him. Across the street, standing just outside the light of the Golden Horn, was a single, lean figure. Cyrus Vane. His arm was still in a sling, but he stood tall, watching the smoldering ruin of his army's attack. He had not been in the fight, but he had directed it. As Rip watched, Vane looked directly at him. There was no anger on his face. Only a cold, professional respect, the look of one predator acknowledging another. This hadn't worked. The frontal assault had failed. The next move would have to be different. More personal. Across the muddy, smoke-filled street, in the flickering firelight, Cyrus Vane met Rip's gaze, and with his good hand he slowly, deliberately patted the pearl handle of his gun. It was a challenge. It was a promise. Chapter 21. He wants you in the street. At dawn. The messenger was Vane's bartender, looking even paler and more nervous than usual. He stood in the shattered doorway of Sarah's store, refusing to step inside, as if the ground itself were cursed. He delivered the message to the room at large, but his eyes were fixed on Rip. "Who wants me?" Rip asked, though he already knew the answer. He was cleaning his Colt, a task that had become a familiar ritual in the quiet moments between violence. "Vane," the bartender said, swallowing hard. "Cyrus Vane. He says the fight last night was for rabble. He says the real business is between you and him. One man against the other." Winner takes the town's respect. A heavy silence fell over the room. Jeb Hawkins stopped loading a rifle and spat on the floor. Don't do it, Rip. It's a trick. You step out there, and a dozen of Vane's men will cut you down from the windows. Kane won't have it that way, Amos Cole said, his voice a low rumble. He was looking at Rip, a strange light in his eyes. This ain't Vane's play. This is about pride. A man like Kane, a man who lives by his reputation with a gun, can't let what you did to him stand. He can't have the whole territory knowing he was bested. He'll make sure it's a fair fight. His kind of fair, anyway. There's no such thing as a fair fight with these people, Sarah said, her voice tight with a fear she was trying to hide. She walked over to Rip, her eyes pleading. We held the store. We can keep holding it. Don't throw your life away for a gunslinger's pride. Rip finished assembling his pistol, the final click of the cylinder spinning into place, sounding unnaturally loud in the quiet room. He looked at Sarah, then at the faces of the others. He saw their fear, but he also saw the exhaustion. They had won a battle, but they couldn't win a war of attrition. They were running out of food, ammunition, and time. It's not about my pride, Rip said, his voice quiet. It's about theirs. He stood up, sliding the Colt into its holster. Kane is Vane's top man. He's the symbol of his power. The other hired guns, the ones from Deadwood, they follow him because they respect his speed. They fear him. If I take him down, in the open where everyone can see, that fear starts to crack. The respect starts to crumble. The whole thing Vane has built starts to come apart at the seams. He was right, and they all knew it. This wasn't just a duel. It was a surgical strike aimed at the heart of Vane's authority. He walked to the door and looked at the bartender, who was still hovering there like a nervous ghost. Tell Kane I'll be there, Rip said. The dawn broke cold and gray, the sun a pale, watery disk behind a thin layer of cloud. The mud in the main street had begun to freeze in the night, creating a landscape of sharp, ugly ruts. The town was silent. Not a soul moved. But every window held a pair of watchful eyes. Rip stepped out of the store. He wore no coat, just his shirt and vest, the Colt tied down low on his thigh. He walked to the center of the street and waited. A moment later, the batwing doors of the Golden Horn swung open, and Silas Kane stepped out. His right arm was still in a sling, but his left hand, his offhand, hung loose and ready over a second pistol he'd strapped to his left hip. He'd been practicing. He walked to the center of the street until he was 50 feet from Rip. The whole town held its breath. I should have killed you in the alley, Kane said, his voice carrying in the still morning air. You should have tried, Rip replied. They stood there for a long, agonizing moment, two statues in a tableau of imminent death. Rip watched Kane's eyes. He saw the flicker of pain from his wounded arm. He saw the cold, murderous focus. He saw the subtle shift in weight as Kane prepared to draw with his left hand. Kane moved. He was fast, unnaturally so for an offhand draw. The pistol cleared the leather in a black blur. But Rip was already moving. He had seen the decision in Kane's eyes, the tightening of the muscles in his shoulder. Rip's own draw was a smooth, practiced, violent poem. The Colt seemed to leap into his hand. The first shot was Rip's. It wasn't aimed at Kane's chest. It was aimed at his hand. The bullet struck the pistol Kane was drawing, the impact sending a shock up his arm and tearing the gun from his grasp. It flew through the air, landing in the frozen mud. Kane cried out, a sound of pure, frustrated rage, and stared at his empty, stinging hand. Rip's second shot followed an instant later. It was not aimed to disarm. It was aimed to end it. The bullet took Silas Kane square in the gut. The impact doubled him over. The fight, the pride, the reputation. It all vanished from his face, replaced by a look of profound, childlike surprise. He looked down at the dark, spreading stain on his shirt, then back up at Rip. He opened his mouth as if to say something, but only a wet, gurgling sound came out. He took one stumbling step, then another, and then he collapsed face first into the cold, hard mud of the street he had tried to rule. A collective gasp went through the town. It was over. From the porch of the Golden Horn, Cyrus Vane watched, his face a mask of cold, controlled fury. His ace was dead. The symbol of his power lay bleeding in the street. The other hired guns, the ones from Deadwood, looked at each other, their professional confidence shaken. They had signed on to fight miners, not to face a man who could do that. But one man wasn't shaken. He was enraged. Bull Ramsey stepped out from beside Vane. He looked at Kane's body, then at Rip. He wasn't a gunman. He was a brute, and his only tool was violence. His face, already a mess of bruises and broken cartilage, twisted into a mask of pure animalistic hatred. He let out a roar that echoed through the silent street, a sound of a wounded bear ready to tear the world apart. He didn't reach for a gun. He just lowered his head and charged. Chapter 22. Bull Ramsey's roar of animal fury was cut short by the cold, clear voice of his employer. "Stand down, Bull." Cyrus Vane had stepped off the porch of the Golden Horn. He stood over the body of his fastest gun, his face a placid mask that didn't quite hide the furious, reptilian coldness in his eyes. He looked at Ramsey, who had skidded to a halt in the middle of the street, his fists clenched, his whole body trembling with the need to charge. "I said, stand down," Vane repeated, his voice soft but carrying the sharp crack of a whip. Ramsey hesitated, torn between his rage and his fear of the man who paid him. The fear won. With a low, guttural growl, he took a step back, his eyes never leaving Rip. Rip hadn't moved. His Colt was still warm in his hand, a thin wisp of smoke curling from its barrel. He watched Vane, not the brute. Ramsey was just a dog. Vane held the leash. Vane looked down at Silas Kane's body, as if it were a piece of poorly made furniture. Then he looked up, his gaze sweeping over the faces in the windows, the men on the rooftops, and finally settling on Rip. "This has gone on long enough," Vane announced, his voice carrying across the silent, muddy street. "This town has a choice to make. You have sheltered a murderer." He nudged Kane's body with the toe of his fine leather boot. "You have conspired against the lawful authority of this community. You have chosen chaos." He raised his voice, ensuring every hidden watcher could hear him. "I am giving you 1 hour. 1 hour to lay down your arms and surrender the man called Campbell. Do this, and you will be treated fairly. The law will run its course." He smiled, a thin, bloodless expression. "My law. And if we don't?" A voice called out from the roof of Sarah's store. It was Jeb Hawkins. Vane's smile widened. "Then I will do what should have been done weeks ago. I will cleanse this town. I will burn every building on that side of the street to the ground. Then I will burn the other side for good measure. I will erase this pathetic rebellion from the map. You have 1 hour to decide if you want to be a town or a field of ash." He turned without another word and walked back into the Golden Horn, leaving Bull Ramsey and 2 other men to drag Silas Kane's body out of the mud. The ultimatum had been delivered. Inside the store, the air was thick with the smell of fear. "He means it," the freight merchant Miller said, his voice shaking. "He'll do it. He'll burn us all." "We can't fight his whole army," another man whispered. "Look what happened last night. We got lucky. We can't get lucky again." The courage that had been forged in the night raid and the duel was beginning to crumble, replaced by the cold, practical terror of annihilation. Rip looked at their faces, at the doubt and the fear. He walked to the center of the room. "He's right," Rip said, his voice cutting through the murmurs. The men stared at him. "He will burn this town. He'll do it, whether we surrender or not." "You think a man like that keeps his promises to people he sees as insects?" He shook his head. "You give me up, and he'll kill me. Then he'll kill you, for the crime of having defied him in the first place. He won't leave witnesses. His kind never does." He looked from man to man, his gaze steady. "He's given us 1 hour. That's an hour he needs. Why? Because he's not as strong as he looks. We bloodied him last night. I took down his top gun this morning. His hired guns from Deadwood, they're professionals. They signed on for easy money, not to die in a street fight against a bunch of dirt diggers who refuse to quit. Right now, they're wondering if Vane's gold is worth it." He let that sink in. "We have 1 hour to make them sure it's not. We have 1 hour to prepare for the last fight this town will ever see. You can spend that hour on your knees, waiting for the fire. Or you can spend it on your feet, loading your rifle." He didn't wait for their answer. He turned to Sarah. "We'll need a place for the wounded. Your back room." Sarah nodded, her face pale but her eyes resolute. "I'll get the women. We'll be ready." She began tearing what was left of her clean sheets into more bandages, her movements sharp and purposeful. Rip looked at Jeb and Sam. "I need to know what he's planning. How he's going to make his move. I need eyes in his camp." "We'll go," Sam said immediately, his youthful fear replaced by a hardened resolve. "Stay low," Rip commanded. "Don't get seen. Just watch. I need to know where his men are, where he is. Find a weakness." As the town prepared for the final battle, a grim, determined quiet settling over them, Sam and Jeb slipped out the back of the store. They moved through the alleyways, using the skills Rip had taught them, until they were behind the Golden Horn. They found a spot in a collapsed shed across the alley, peering through a crack in the boards. They saw Vane's men gathering, a small army preparing for war. They saw Bull Ramsey handing out boxes of ammunition. But they saw something else too. 2 of Vane's men weren't grabbing rifles. They were carrying heavy wooden crates out of the saloon's cellar. Crates marked with the familiar warning, dynamite. They didn't take the crates outside. They carried them back into the saloon. Jeb and Sam exchanged a look of cold dread. They watched for another 10 minutes. They saw the men placing sticks of dynamite against the main support beams in the saloon's cavernous main room. They saw them running wires from the explosives to a single plunger box hidden behind the bar. "My God," Jeb whispered, his voice hoarse. "It's not a threat." "What is it?" Sam asked, his heart pounding. Jeb looked at the boy, his old face a mask of grim understanding. "It's an insurance policy. He's not just planning to burn the town if he loses. He's planning to blow his own saloon to kingdom come." "But why?" Sam stammered. "It's everything he owns." "Because it's not about the saloon anymore, kid," Jeb said, his eyes fixed on the men running the wires. "It's about the evidence. The gold we stole is gone. But his ledgers, his records of every crooked deal, every man he's cheated, every murder he's paid for, they're all in that office safe. He's not just planning to destroy the town. He's planning to erase his entire life here, so no one can ever prove what he did." They slipped away, their hearts cold with the terrible knowledge. They ran back to the store, bursting in to find Rip directing the placement of the last barricade. "Rip?" Sam gasped, out of breath. "Vane, he's wired the saloon. He's going to blow it up." Rip stopped what he was doing. A new, terrible understanding dawned on his face. This wasn't just a fight to save the town anymore. It was a race against a man who was ready to burn his own kingdom down, just to make sure no one else could ever sit on the throne. Chapter 23. It's quiet out there. Jeb Hawkins' voice was a nervous whisper from his post at a boarded-up window. The sun had set, plunging the main street of Buffalo Run into a deep purple twilight. The hour Vane had given them had passed. The whole town was holding its breath. "He's not a man who bluffs," Amos Cole said from across the room, where he sat with his bad leg propped up on a barrel, a Sharp's carbine resting across his lap. He was right. The answer came not as a shout or a charge, but as a deafening explosion. One of Vane's men, creeping forward under the cover of dusk, had thrown a stick of dynamite at the main barricade of overturned ore carts. The blast tore a huge hole in their defenses, sending wood and metal flying. Immediately, the street erupted in a hailstorm of gunfire. Vane's hired guns, positioned in the buildings across the street, opened up with a furious, overwhelming volley, pinning the defenders inside the store. Bullets chewed through the new pine walls, splintering boards and shattering the last of Sarah's jars on the shelves behind them. From his position on the roof, Rip saw the whole strategy unfold. The covering fire was just one part of it. A second group of Vane's men, led by Bull Ramsey, was using the chaos to move up, carrying more explosives, aiming for the walls of the store itself. The east wall. Rip roared down to the men below. "They're coming for the east wall." He raised his own rifle, settling the stock against his shoulder. He wasn't a general giving orders anymore. He was a sharpshooter. He drew a bead on a man running with a lit stick of dynamite in his hand. He squeezed the trigger. The man stumbled, dropping the dynamite, which rolled under the boardwalk and went off with a muffled whump that blew a section of the walkway to splinters. The defenders inside, now directed, shifted their fire. The prospectors, handling the big new carbines with a grim determination, began to take a toll. Their shots were slow, but they were accurate. A man trying to place a charge against the wall cried out and fell. Another dropped his rifle and scrambled back into the darkness. For a moment, it seemed like they might hold. They were outnumbered, but they had cover and the righteous fury of men defending their homes. Then Bull Ramsey made his move. With a roar of pure rage, he charged forward, ignoring the gunfire, a heavy sack of dynamite in his hands. He reached the east wall, shoved the charge into a gap between two flour sack sandbags, and lit the fuse. He turned and ran back into the darkness just as the charge went off. The explosion was catastrophic. A 10-foot section of the store's side wall blew inward in a shower of wood, dust, and debris. The rebels inside were thrown to the floor, their ears ringing, their eyes blinded by the dust. Through the ragged smoking hole, Bull Ramsey charged, a heavy axe in his hands, his face a mask of triumphant hatred. A half-dozen of Vane's men poured in behind him. The fight was no longer a siege. It was a desperate, hand-to-hand brawl in the smoke-filled, chaotic confines of the store. Rip scrambled down the ladder from the roof, landing in the store's back room just as the breach occurred. He came out into the main room to see hell let loose. Sam Tate was on the floor, struggling with one of Vane's men. Sarah was in a corner, firing a pistol at another man who was trying to get to the wounded. Rip saw Ramsey first. The big man was a whirlwind of destruction, swinging his axe, splintering tables and counters. He saw Rip, and his eyes lit up with a homicidal glee. "Campbell!" Ramsey roared. "You're mine!" He charged. Rip fired his Colt, but the bullet only grazed Ramsey's thick shoulder, doing little more than enraging him further. Ramsey was on him before he could fire again. The axe swung, and Rip dove aside, the heavy blade burying itself in the floor where he'd been standing. Rip kicked out, catching Ramsey in the knee. The big man grunted, but didn't go down. He wrenched the axe free and came at Rip again. Rip threw a chair at him, which Ramsey smashed aside like it was kindling. They crashed into each other, a brutal collision of speed and strength. Rip drove his shoulder into Ramsey's gut, trying to get inside the wild swing of the axe. They fell to the floor, wrestling, trading short, brutal punches. Ramsey's sheer size was overwhelming. His huge hands found Rip's throat, squeezing, the world starting to go dark at the edges of Rip's vision. With a final desperate surge of strength, Rip bucked, throwing Ramsey off balance. He scrambled away, grabbing the nearest thing he could find, his Winchester rifle, which had been leaning against the counter. Ramsey was getting to his feet, a triumphant grin on his bloody face, ready to finish it. Rip didn't have time to aim. He didn't have time to fire. He swung the heavy rifle like a baseball bat. The solid walnut stock connected with the side of Bull Ramsey's head with a sickening, wet crack. The big man's eyes went wide with surprise, then rolled back in his head. He dropped the axe and collapsed to the floor like a felled tree, unconscious. The fight seemed to drain out of Vane's men. Seeing their leader down, and facing the furious, desperate defense of the prospectors, Amos firing from the floor, Jeb swinging a pickaxe handle, Sarah holding her ground with an empty pistol, they began to fall back, scrambling out through the hole they had made. The rebels had held the line. But the cost was staggering. The store was a wreck, half demolished and filled with smoke. Miller, the freight agent, lay dead near the door. 2 other prospectors were badly wounded, being tended to by a weeping but resolute Sarah. They were alive, but they were battered, exhausted, and running out of everything. Rip got to his feet, his body screaming in protest, his head ringing. He looked at the devastation, at his small, wounded army. He knew they couldn't withstand another attack. He walked to the gaping hole in the wall and looked out. Vane's men were retreating toward the Golden Horn. The attack had failed. But Vane still had one card left to play. The dynamite. Rip looked across the street at the saloon, its windows glowing with a sinister light. He knew Vane was in there, ready to push the plunger, ready to erase it all. He had to be stopped. Not with a defense. Not with a plan. Just one man against another. He turned to Amos, whose face was grim. "He's going to blow it," Rip said, his voice a low rasp. "All of it." Amos nodded slowly. "There's no stopping him." "Someone has to try," Rip said. He checked his Colt, ensuring it was loaded, and started walking toward the door. "I'm going in." Chapter 24. He's going to blow it all to hell. Amos Cole's words were a grim eulogy for the town, spoken from the shattered doorway of the store. Across the street, the Golden Horn Saloon stood quiet, a monster holding its breath, waiting for the command to self-destruct. The fires started by Vane's men in the failed raid were spreading, small hungry flames licking at the dry wood of the adjacent buildings. The night was lit by the flickering, hellish glow of a town beginning to burn. Rip didn't waste time on words. He looked at the saloon, at the dark windows that hid his enemy. He knew he couldn't go in the front. He couldn't go in the back. But Vane, in his arrogance, had made a mistake. He had assumed the fight would stay on the main street. Rip turned and ran, not toward the saloon, but down the narrow dark alley alongside the store. He vaulted a fence, landing in the muddy yard behind the assayer's office. He kept moving, a shadow flitting through a maze of outbuildings and trash heaps, circling around, coming at the Golden Horn from the one direction no one would expect, the side. He reached the wall of the saloon's storeroom. A single grimy window, barred on the inside, was set high in the wall. He took the butt of his Colt and smashed the glass, the sound lost in the crackle of the nearby fires. He reached through the broken pane, his hand finding the simple latch. It was locked. He fired one shot, the bullet pulverizing the lock mechanism. He slid the window open, hauled himself up, and dropped inside. He landed in a room stacked high with barrels of whiskey and crates of rotting vegetables. The roar of the fires outside was muffled here. He could hear the low hum of voices from the main saloon room. He drew his Colt, his boots making no sound on the dusty floorboards, and moved toward the connecting door. He peered through a crack in the wood. The scene was one of quiet, desperate preparation. Vane was there, his fine suit smudged with soot, his face a mask of cold fury. He was directing two of his remaining men as they loaded heavy leather sacks into a large, sturdy wagon that had been pulled right up to the back doors of the saloon. It was a freight wagon built for heavy loads, gold-laden. The plunger box for the dynamite sat on the bar, a squat, ugly thing with two wires snaking from it, disappearing under the floorboards. Vane wasn't just going to blow the saloon. He was going to do it from a distance, after he and his gold were clear. Rip knew he had no time. He couldn't disable the explosives. He couldn't fight his way through the remaining gunmen. He had to make a choice. The town or the man. The evidence or the gold. He watched as Vane, satisfied with the loading, climbed onto the driver's seat of the wagon. "Get the horses," Vane ordered his men. That was the moment. Rip kicked the storeroom door open, the wood slamming against the wall. He stepped into the main room. "Leaving so soon, Vane?" Rip's voice was quiet, but it cut through the room like a razor. Vane spun around, his face a mask of shock and disbelief. The two hired guns went for their pistols. They were fast, but they were focused on the wrong threat. Rip didn't fire at them. He fired twice at the huge mirror behind the bar. The mirror exploded in a shower of 1,000 glass fragments, a sound like a lightning strike indoors. The two men flinched, instinctively ducking from the flying glass. It was the only opening Rip needed. He was already moving, diving behind an overturned poker table as the two men recovered and opened fire. Splinters flew from the table. Rip fired back from his cover, not trying to kill them but to keep them pinned. He heard the crack of a whip and the frantic scramble of horses. Vane was making a run for it. The heavy wagon lurched forward, crashing through the saloon's wide back doors and out into the alley. Rip cursed. He had to get out. He fired 2 more shots toward the gunman, then scrambled out from behind the table and made a desperate run for the front of the saloon. He burst through the batwing doors just as the gold-laden wagon, pulled by a team of 4 powerful horses, careened out of the back alley and onto the main street, heading south away from the town. The chase was on. Rip ran, his lungs burning, his legs pumping through the thick mud. The town was a vision of hell around him. Buildings were now fully engulfed in flame, casting a wild, dancing light on the scene. The heat was immense. The wagon was heavy, its wheels sinking into the mud, slowing it down. Rip was gaining. He could see Vane on the driver's seat, whipping the horses into a frenzy, his face a demonic mask in the firelight. Rip raised his Colt, his arm steady despite his ragged breathing. He didn't aim for Vane. The man was too small a target, the wagon bouncing too much. He aimed for something bigger. Something that would stop the whole machine. He aimed for the left rear wheel of the heavy wagon. He fired. The bullet struck the iron rim with a loud clang. He fired again. A chunk of wood splintered from one of the thick spokes. Vane looked back, his eyes wide with a dawning panic. He whipped the horses harder. Rip took a steadying breath, planted his feet in the mud, and aimed for the 3rd time. He squeezed the trigger. The heavy slug struck the already damaged spoke, dead center. The wood shattered. The wheel, its integrity gone, collapsed inward with a terrible grinding screech. The heavy wagon, its axle digging into the mud, slewed sideways and crashed to a halt, tilted at a drunken angle, sacks of gold spilling into the street. Vane was thrown from his seat, landing hard in the mud. He came up, his fine suit ruined, his face a mask of pure primal hatred. He had lost. He scrambled to his feet and drew his own pistol, a small, elegant derringer that looked like a toy in his hand. "You think this is over?" Vane screamed, his voice cracking with fury. "This town is mine. Even its ashes." He raised the derringer. Rip stood 50 feet away, his Colt steady, the hammer already cocked. Vane fired. His shot went wide, a desperate, angry gesture. Rip's answer was calm, precise, and final. His shot was true. The bullet struck Cyrus Vane in the center of his chest. The man looked down, a profound look of surprise on his face, as if he couldn't comprehend that the rules of his own world had just been used against him. He dropped the derringer, took a single, stumbling step backward, and fell. He lay still in the mud, his dead eyes reflecting the flames of the town he had built and destroyed. Rip stood there, the Colt smoking in his hand, his chest heaving. He looked at Vane's body, at the spilled sacks of gold, at the burning buildings. It was then that he heard a new sound, a deep, ominous groan coming from the Golden Horn Saloon. The fire from the street had finally reached it, licking at the dry wood, crawling toward the cellar, toward the dynamite. Rip turned and ran, diving behind the wreckage of the barricade just as the world turned white. The Golden Horn Salove erupted in a single, cataclysmic explosion that shook the very foundations of the earth, sending a fireball roaring into the night sky. The shockwave tore through the town, shattering every remaining window, ripping the roof off the mercantile. Then silence. A profound, ringing silence, broken only by the soft, hungry crackle of 100 smaller fires. Rip pushed himself up from the dirt, his ears ringing, his body bruised. He was alive. Vane was dead. And Buffalo Run was a field of ash. Chapter 25. The sun came up on a town that looked like a fresh wound. The air, thick with the smell of wet ash and pine smoke, was cold and still. Where the Golden Horn Saloon had stood, there was now just a blackened, steaming crater, a testament to the fact that Cyrus Vane had been a man who would rather burn his kingdom than lose his crown. The survivors moved through the wreckage like ghosts. They were victorious, but victory felt a lot like just being alive when you should be dead. They started the slow, grim work of putting out the last of the fires, their faces smudged with soot, their eyes hollowed out by the long, violent night. Rip Campbell was not among them. He was already working, his movements stiff and pained but relentless. He was helping Sarah Miles clear the debris from the front of her store. The building was a wreck, scorched, bullet-riddled, one wall blown half to hell, but it was standing. And in a town of ash and craters, that made it a castle. He heaved a charred timber out of the doorway. Sarah, her face pale but her eyes clear, was sweeping up shattered glass with a grim determination. They didn't speak. There was nothing to say that the shared labor couldn't. "The gold," Sarah said after a long silence, her voice raspy. "The sacks Vane was trying to escape with. They're still out there in the street." "It's not his gold anymore," Rip said. "It belongs to the town now. What's left of it?" By mid-morning, a meeting had been called. The surviving prospectors and the few remaining townsfolk gathered in front of Sarah's store. They stood around the sacks of gold Rip and Amos had dragged in from the street, a tangible symbol of what they had fought for. Reverend Holt, his face smudged with soot but his eyes burning with a righteous fire, said a few words over the bodies of the men they had lost, 2 prospectors and the freight agent Miller. His prayer was short and hard, a prayer for the living who now had the difficult job of building something worthy of the dead. When he was done, Jeb Hawkins, his old face looking ancient in the morning light, stepped onto a crate. "We've bled for this place," he said, his voice rough. "We've buried good men in this mud. Now we got a choice. We can scatter to the winds, let this place die, and let Vane win. Or we can build it back. Build it right this time." He looked around at the faces staring up at him. A town needs a leader, not a boss like Vane. A mayor. Someone to see that claims are filed fair and disputes are settled with words, not guns. That sounds like a man who's volunteering, Amos Cole called out from the crowd, a rare grim smile on his face. A murmur of agreement went through the small crowd. Jeb looked surprised, then weary, then resigned. All right, he sighed. But the first order of business for this new government is to hire a town marshal. A man to make sure the law we write is the law that's kept. Every eye in the crowd turned to Rip. Jeb looked down at him from the crate. The job's yours, Rip. Name your price. This town owes you its life. We want you to stay. We need you to stay. Rip stood with his arms crossed, leaning against a support beam of the store. He looked at the hopeful faces. He looked at Sarah, who was watching him with an intensity that made it hard to breathe. He saw a future laid out before him. Respect, a home, a purpose. A place to stop running. He thought about it for a long moment. He thought about the quiet satisfaction of the hammer in his hand, of building something instead of tearing it down. He thought about the taste of coffee that wasn't boiled over a lonely campfire. Then he shook his head. A slow, final gesture. A town needs a man who wants to stay, Rip said, his voice quiet but carrying in the silence. A man who wants to put down roots. That ain't me. He looked at Amos. You were a soldier. You know how to keep order. The job should be yours. Amos looked surprised, then nodded slowly. I'll do it. Until we find someone better. A palpable sense of disappointment went through the crowd. Sarah looked away, her face unreadable, and went back to sweeping the glass from her porch. Rip didn't try to explain further. There were no words for the restlessness in his soul, the ingrained habit of the trail that pulled at him like gravity. He had been the storm that had cleansed the town. But the storm always moves on. He gave a curt nod to Jeb, then walked over to where Sandy was tethered. He saddled the mare, his movements efficient and practiced. The townspeople watched him, their hero preparing to abandon them. But there was no anger in their silence. Only a quiet, sad understanding. He swung into the saddle. He looked one last time at the ruined street, at the determined faces of the people who would rebuild it. He saw Sarah, who had stopped her sweeping to watch him, her knuckles white on the broom handle. Their eyes met across the distance, a silent acknowledgement of what might have been and what could never be. Without a word, Rip turned Sandy and rode out of town, heading west toward the high, lonely hills. He didn't look back. He rode for an hour, the silence of the plains a welcome balm. He crested a high ridge and reined in his horse. From here, he could see the whole valley laid out below him. He looked back at Buffalo Run. It was just a smudge of smoke and determination in the vastness of the landscape. It looked small. It looked fragile. But he knew it would survive. It had good people in it. It had a future. It just wasn't his future. He sat there for a long moment, a solitary figure against the immense empty sky. Then, with a slow, deliberate motion, he reached up and tipped the brim of his hat to the town he was leaving behind. It was a gesture of respect. A final farewell. Then he turned his horse west and rode on, a man ready for the next fight on the next trail in a world that was full of them.